What if the fate of empires rested on a single, controversial choice? Picture a ruler standing alone, the weight of kingdoms on their shoulders, knowing that one decision could elevate their civilization to glory or plunge it into ruin. These are the moments that shaped our world, the turning points where history held its breath, where leaders faced impossible dilemmas and chose paths that still echo through the centuries. Today, we're exploring 25 of the most jaw-dropping, consequential, and hotly debated decisions ever made by ancient leaders. These weren't just political maneuvers, they were gambles with eternity, choices that determined the rise and fall of cultures, the spread of ideas, and the very map of human civilization. From the sun-baked courts of Egypt to the marble halls of Rome, these leaders stood at the crossroads of history and made calls that were brilliant, baffling, and always controversial. Some of these choices were strokes of genius that secured legacies for millennia. Others were catastrophic miscalculations that led to downfall and disaster. But every single one offers a window into the minds of those who held power in a world without margin for error, a world where one decision could mean life or death for thousands, and where the consequences rippled far beyond their own lifetimes. This journey isn't just about recounting events, it's about understanding the humanity behind these monumental choices. What drove a pharaoh to defy tradition? What convinced an emperor to risk everything on a seemingly reckless campaign? How did a general's split-second choice alter the course of civilization? As we unpack these mysteries together, you'll not only discover the startling truths behind history's most debated moves, you'll also gain a deeper appreciation for the fragile, unpredictable nature of power itself. So settle in, open your mind, and prepare to explore the moments when ancient leaders stared into the abyss and decided to leap. Our journey into these world-altering choices begins not on a battlefield, but in the realm of faith with a pharaoh who dared to rewrite the divine order itself. In the golden age of ancient Egypt, around the year 1353 BCE, a new ruler ascended to the throne. His name was Amenhotep IV, but he would soon change it to Akhenaten, meaning effective for the Aten. And that name change was just the beginning of a revolution that would shake one of the world's most stable empires to its core. For over 1,000 years, Egyptian society had been woven together by a complex tapestry of gods and goddesses: Amun, Osiris, Isis, Horus. This polytheistic system wasn't just religion, it was the very bedrock of culture, politics, and daily life. The powerful priests of Amun, in particular, held immense wealth and influence, almost rivaling the pharaoh's own power. Then, seemingly out of nowhere, Akhenaten declared that all these deities were obsolete. He proclaimed that there was only one true god worthy of worship, Aten, the radiant sun disk. This was a breathtakingly radical idea, arguably the first recorded instance of monotheism in human history. But Akhenaten didn't stop at theological pronounctions. To fully break from the past, he ordered the construction of an entirely new capital city, built from scratch in the desert and dedicated solely to Aten. He called it Akhenaten, the horizon of the Aten known today as Amarna. Imagine the sheer audacity of this move, abandoning the ancient, bustling capital of Thebes, with its magnificent temples and established power structures, for a barren patch of land where his vision could reign supreme. Art and culture were also revolutionized under his decree. Gone were the idealized, formal depictions of pharaohs as stoic, unchanging gods. In their place, Amarna art presented a startlingly naturalistic and intimate style. We see Akhenaten with an elongated head, a potbelly, and full lips, often shown in tender moments with his wife, Nefertiti, and their children beneath the rays of the Aten. This was a deliberate propaganda campaign, showcasing a new, personal relationship with a single, loving God. But this spiritual upheaval came with a dark side. To enforce his new doctrine, Akhenaten systematically dismantled the old religious infrastructure. He sent agents across the kingdom to chisel out the names of the old gods, particularly Ammon, from monuments and temples. The vast estates and treasuries that funded the powerful priesthoods were seized and redirected to the cult of Aten. For the average Egyptian, this was more than confusing, it was terrifying. Their entire understanding of the universe, their rituals for the afterlife, and their means of seeking divine favor were suddenly declared invalid. This begs the monumental question at the heart of his decision. Was Akhenaten a true visionary, a prophet who saw a single divine truth centuries before others? Or was this entire revolution an elaborate political power play, a coldly calculated strategy to break the influence of the priestly class and consolidate absolute authority under the throne? The aftermath suggests the societal cost was immense. The empire's foreign relations and domestic economy, traditionally managed with the blessing of the gods, appear to have suffered from neglect as all attention turned inward to the Aten. When Akhenaten died after 17 years, his revolution died with him. His name was erased from official king lists, his city of Amarna was abandoned to the sands, and Egypt fervently returned to its old gods, trying to wipe this controversial interlude from memory. His legacy was one of the most dramatic and short-lived religious experiments in history, a bold gamble that forever altered the path of a civilization, only to be violently rejected. From the sun-scorched sands of Egypt, we travel forward more than 1,000 years to the heart of the Roman Empire, to a night of unimaginable terror. In the sweltering summer of 64 CE, a fire broke out in the shops around Rome's Circus Maximus. Fanned by strong winds, the flames quickly became an uncontrollable inferno, raging for 6 days and 7 nights. When it was finally extinguished, it reignited and burned for another 3 days. By the end, 70% of the eternal city was smoldering rubble. 10 of Rome's 14 districts were utterly destroyed. Countless lives were lost, and ancient temples, public buildings, and homes were reduced to ash. In the chaotic aftermath, the young Emperor Nero, just 26 years old, faced a population desperate for answers and someone to blame. Rumors swirled through the traumatized crowds. Some claimed they had seen men actively fanning the flames, preventing people from fighting the fire. The most damning rumor of all, however, was that the emperor himself was responsible. The ancient historians Tacitus and Suetonius both report the infamous story that Nero, obsessed with rebuilding Rome to his own glorious design, fiddled while Rome burned, allegedly performing a poem about the fall of Troy as he watched the city blaze from the safety of his palace. Whether this theatrical accusation is true or just brilliant political slander, Nero realized he had a massive crisis of legitimacy on his hands. He needed a scapegoat, a group so marginalized and misunderstood that the public would readily believe them capable of such a monstrous act. He found his answer in a small, secretive sect known as Christians. To the Roman populace, Christians were a suspicious bunch. They were rumored to practice cannibalism by metaphorically eating the body and blood of Christ, and incest by calling each other brother and sister. Their refusal to worship the Roman gods or deify the emperor made them seem like atheists and traitors. Nero pounced. Tacitus, writing decades later, recounts that the emperor fabricated confessions by arresting Christians and forcing them to name their fellow believers under torture. A horrific wave of state-sanctioned violence followed. Christians were not merely executed, they were transformed into public spectacles of supreme cruelty. They were sewn into the skins of wild beasts and torn apart by dogs. They were crucified. Most infamously, they were covered in tar, impaled on stakes, and set ablaze to serve as human torches, illuminating Nero's gardens for his evening parties. This decision was controversial even in its own time. Tacitus, no friend to the Christians, explicitly states that they were convicted not for the public good but to satisfy one man's cruelty. He calls their punishment an exercise in pity, as they were clearly being sacrificed for Nero's brutality rather than for any real justice. The controversy we grapple with today is twofold. First, did Nero actually start the fire to clear space for his extravagant new palace, the Domus Aurea or Golden House? Or was it a tragic accident that he simply saw a cynical opportunity within? The historical evidence is murky, a mix of fact and political propaganda from his enemies. The second, and far more profound, controversy is the legacy of his scapegoating. This event set a terrifying precedent, officially marking Christians as enemies of the Roman state and launching the first of many imperial persecutions. It was a calculated decision to sacrifice a vulnerable minority to protect the emperor's power, a brutal manipulation of public fear that echoes through history. Nero's choice wasn't just about finding someone to blame. It was about using raw, theatrical violence to reaffirm his authority, demonstrating that in the face of disaster, the most vulnerable would always be the first to burn. Leaving behind the chaotic streets of ancient Rome, we journey even further back in time, to the dawn of a unified China, where a different kind of fire was being lit, one intended not to destroy buildings but to erase history itself. In 213 BCE, the first emperor of China, Qin Shi Huang, stood atop a newly forged empire. He had conquered 6 warring states through brutal military campaigns, creating a single, centralized nation for the first time. But his conquest of territory was only half the battle. The real challenge was conquering the minds of his people, who still held loyalties to their old kingdoms, their old histories, and their old ways of thinking. To solve this, the emperor and his ruthless advisor, Lai Si, devised one of the most infamous campaigns of intellectual suppression the world has ever known. They issued a decree: all books of history, poetry, and philosophy that were not about the state-approved Qin dynasty or its pragmatic legalist philosophy were to be surrendered to the authorities. This wasn't a gentle suggestion, it was an order backed by the threat of mutilation or forced labor. The only texts spared were practical manuals on agriculture, medicine, and prophecy, works that served the state's immediate needs. The collected libraries of the past were then piled high and set ablaze. Imagine the sheer scale of this cultural annihilation. Countless unique manuscripts, historical records from conquered states, and the foundational texts of Confucianism and other schools of thought were consumed by the flames. The goal was to create a collective amnesia, to sever the people's connection to any past that predated the Qin dynasty. Without a history to look back to, they would have no alternative vision for the future except the one the emperor provided. But the burning of books was only the first part of the horror. The ancient historian Sima Qian records that the emperor grew suspicious that the scholars at his court were secretly criticizing him and clinging to the old, forbidden teachings. In response, he allegedly ordered over 400 of these intellectuals to be buried alive. This burying of the scholars was a direct and brutal attack on the intellectual class itself, a message that dissenting thought would not just be silenced but physically exterminated. This leads us to the central, haunting controversy of Qin Shi Huang's reign. Was this cultural eradication a necessary, if horrifying, evil required to unify a fractured land? Proponents of this view argue that China had been trapped in centuries of bloody warfare between the states. The emperor's legalist philosophy, with its strict, uniform laws and absolute obedience to the state, was the only system harsh enough to hammer these disparate cultures into a single nation. By destroying competing ideologies, he enforced a unity that ultimately gave China its name, its written language, its standardized currency, and even the first version of the Great Wall. In this light, the burning and burying were the terrible price of peace and progress. The opposing view sees not a visionary unifier, but the ultimate tyrant, a man so obsessed with control that he tried to murder memory itself. The loss was incalculable. We can only guess at the vast stores of knowledge, literature, and alternative historical perspectives that were lost forever. creating gaps in our understanding of ancient China that can never be filled. His actions set a dangerous precedent for state censorship that would echo for millennia, and for all his efforts to secure an eternal dynasty, his reign collapsed into chaos almost immediately after his death, a stark lesson that tyranny built on fear is ultimately a fragile thing. His lasting legacy is therefore a paradox. We remember him both as the architect of a nation and as a cautionary tale of the price of absolute power, a price measured in ashes and bones. Shifting our focus from the unification of China to the dramatic end of an Egyptian dynasty, we find a leader whose name still evokes intrigue and debate, Cleopatra VII. Far from the simplistic tale of a seductress that Roman propaganda would have us believe, Cleopatra's decision to form a deep alliance with the Roman general Mark Antony was a masterclass in high-stakes geopolitical strategy, one that would ultimately seal the fate of her kingdom. By the time she met Antony, Cleopatra was already a seasoned ruler. She spoke multiple languages, was shrewd in economics and diplomacy, and was fiercely dedicated to preserving Egypt's independence from the expanding grasp of Rome. Her partnership with Antony was, on its surface, a revival of her earlier strategy with Julius Caesar. She sought a powerful Roman champion to act as a shield for Egypt. Antony, as one of the three rulers of the Roman Republic in the Second Triumvirate, controlled the wealthy eastern provinces. He needed Egypt's vast grain supplies and incredible wealth to fund his own ambitious military campaigns, particularly against the Parthian Empire. Their meeting in Tarsus was less a seduction and more a negotiation between equals. She arrived on a magnificent barge, presenting herself not as a supplicant but as a fellow sovereign, offering the resources he desperately needed in exchange for his protection and the restoration of Egyptian territories lost to Rome. Together, they crafted a powerful vision. Their political and personal union produced children, and Antony took the extraordinary step of granting vast Roman-held lands to Cleopatra and their sons in a ceremony known as the Donations of Alexandria. This was a direct challenge to the Roman Senate and, more importantly, to Antony's rival Octavian back in Rome. Octavian, the future Emperor Augustus, seized on this as proof that Antony had fallen under a foreign queen's spell and was planning to rule an Eastern empire from Alexandria, moving the very heart of Roman power to Egypt. He launched a vicious propaganda war, portraying Cleopatra as a decadent, manipulative sorceress and Antony as her emasculated, un-Roman puppet. Coins minted by Octavian bore the phrase, "to the whole of Italy," rallying the Roman people against the foreign threat he claimed they faced. The controversy surrounding Cleopatra's decision is as potent today as it was 2,000 years ago. Was this a brilliant, last-ditch effort to preserve Egyptian sovereignty by playing the Roman game of power politics better than anyone else? From this perspective, she wasn't a lovesick queen but a pragmatic ruler who secured the strongest Roman military leader of the age as her partner. She used her resources to buy a promise of security and expansion for her nation, a calculated gamble that nearly paid off. Or was it a catastrophic romantic and political blunder? Critics argue that by so openly challenging Octavian and flaunting her influence over Antony, she played directly into his hands. She gave Octavian the perfect casus belli to declare war not on a fellow Roman, but on her, framing the conflict as a patriotic war for Rome's survival against an Oriental menace. This narrative united the Romans behind Octavian in a way a civil war between two generals might not have. The final act of this tragedy played out at the Battle of Actium in 31 BCE. The reasons for their defeat are still debated, whether it was a misguided naval strategy, an actual betrayal, or simply being outmaneuvered by Octavian's brilliant naval commander, Agrippa. What is certain is that the defeat was absolute. Antony and Cleopatra fled back to Alexandria, their forces shattered. Facing certain capture and the horrific prospect of being paraded through the streets of Rome as trophies in Octavian's triumph, they both chose to take their own lives. With them died the last independent Hellenistic kingdom, and Egypt was annexed as a personal province of the Roman emperor. Cleopatra's choice to ally with Mark Antony remains one of history's ultimate what-if scenarios. It was a gamble for the highest possible stakes, the preservation of a 3,000-year-old civilization. Her failure ensured her demonization by the victors, but a closer look reveals a leader who, faced with the overwhelming tide of Roman imperialism, chose to fight with every weapon at her disposal, including diplomacy, wealth, and yes, her own formidable intellect and charm. She didn't lose because she was a woman who loved too much. She lost because she was a monarch who dared to challenge Rome, and in that era, that was a battle almost impossible to win. And speaking of challenging Rome, few leaders in history ever did so with such breathtaking audacity as the Carthaginian general Hannibal Barca. While Cleopatra's gamble played out in the courts and on the seas, Hannibal's war was one of pure, earth-shaking military force. In the year 218 BCE, with the ink on a fragile peace treaty barely dry, this 29-year-old commander made a decision so daring it still defies belief. He would not wait for the Romans to bring the war to his doorstep in Spain or North Africa. Instead, he would take the fight directly to the heart of their republic in Italy, and he would do so by accomplishing the impossible, marching an army complete with 37 war elephants over the treacherous, snow-covered peaks of the Alps. Consider for a moment the sheer scale of the logistical nightmare he was embracing. His force wasn't a small raiding party. It was a full-scale invasion army of around 50,000 soldiers, thousands of horses and pack mules, and those iconic pachyderms. The journey from his stronghold in Spain was over 1,000 miles on foot through hostile territory. Long before he even reached the mountains, he had to navigate the lands of fierce Gallic tribes who were not always friendly, cross mighty rivers like the Rhone, and keep his diverse army of mercenaries from North Africa, Spain, and Gaul supplied, motivated, and intact. Then came the Alps themselves, a towering, frozen wall of rock and ice that stood between him and his destiny. This was not a picturesque mountain range to be admired. It was a natural fortress of sheer cliffs, narrow paths that crumbled underfoot, and blinding blizzards. Ancient sources like the historian Livy describe harrowing scenes, soldiers and pack animals losing their footing and plummeting to their deaths, men freezing solid in the cold, and constant, deadly ambushes from local mountain tribes who rolled boulders down onto the vulnerable column from the cliffs above. The elephants, for all their intimidating power, were a constant problem. They consumed vast amounts of food and water, and their massive weight threatened to collapse the precarious paths. Hannibal's engineers reportedly had to pour vinegar on limestone rocks and light fires to crack them, just to widen the trail for the great beasts to pass. The central, enduring mystery of this epic trek is the exact route he took. Historians and archaeologists have debated this for centuries, with theories placing his pass anywhere from the Col de Clapia to the more southerly Col de la Traversette. Each potential path presents its own set of geographical challenges that align with the ancient descriptions of rockfalls, dizzying heights, and snowy descents. This uncertainty only adds to the legendary quality of the march, a testament to its almost mythic difficulty. So we are left with the monumental question: was this staggering gamble a stroke of strategic genius or a catastrophic example of overambition? The genius argument is powerful. By appearing in northern Italy as if from nowhere, Hannibal achieved complete strategic surprise. The Romans believed the Alps were their impregnable northern shield. His crossing shattered that illusion and sent a wave of psychological terror throughout the Republic. This audacious move allowed him to recruit disaffected Gallic tribes to his cause and fight his first major Italian battles on his own terms, leading to his legendary victories at Trebia and Lake Trasimene, and his masterpiece, the total encirclement and annihilation of a Roman army at Cannae. For 16 years, he would roam Italy undefeated, a ghost haunting the Roman countryside, proving the move's initial tactical success. yet the folly argument holds weight too. The cost of the crossing was horrific. By the time his army stumbled into the fertile plains of Italy, it had been halved by cold, starvation, and attacks. He arrived with maybe 26,000 men and only a handful of his original elephants. While he won battles, he lacked the siege equipment and numbers to take a city as large and well-fortified as Rome itself. His bold invasion became a long, grinding campaign that his homeland, Carthage, failed to adequately support. In the end, he could win every battle but still lose the war, as the Roman general Scipio Africanus would ultimately take the fight back to Carthage, forcing Hannibal to return home and face his final defeat at Zama. Hannibal's decision to cross the Alps was therefore a monumental paradox. It was both a brilliant tactical maneuver that showcased his unparalleled daring and a severe strategic miscalculation that wasted his finest army before the main event even began. It cemented his reputation as one of history's greatest military minds, a commander who would literally move mountains to achieve his goal. But it also ensured that his war would be a desperate struggle from a position of lingering weakness, a breathtaking audacity that ultimately could not be sustained. He bet everything on a single, incredible roll of the dice, and while he won the immediate battle for shock and awe, he may have lost the long war before it even started. But while Hannibal's crossing of the Alps was a desperate invasion, our next decision represents the ultimate act of internal defiance, a moment where a Roman general turned his army not against a foreign enemy, but against the very heart of his own republic. The year is 49 BCE. The setting is a shallow, seemingly insignificant river in northern Italy called the Rubicon. This river wasn't a major geographical barrier, but it held immense political power. It marked the official boundary between the province of Cisalpine Gaul, where a general could legally command his troops, and Italy itself, which was sacred, demilitarized ground. Roman law was absolute. No general could cross this line with his army. To do so was treason, a declaration of war on the Senate and the Roman state itself. On one side of this river stood Julius Caesar. For nearly a decade, he had been conquering Gaul, amassing immense wealth, and building a battle-hardened army fiercely loyal to him personally. But back in Rome, his political enemies, led by the staunch traditionalist Cato the Younger and his rival Pompey the Great, had been maneuvering to destroy him. They demanded Caesar disband his legions and return to Rome as a private citizen, knowing that without the protection of his soldiers, he would be defenseless against prosecution and political annihilation. Caesar was faced with an impossible choice: obey the law and risk losing everything, his status, his fortune, possibly his life, or break the ultimate taboo and march on Rome. He paused on the northern bank, acutely aware of the gravity of the moment. The ancient sources tell us he deliberated with his officers, weighing the terrible consequences for all of Italy should he proceed. Then he made his choice, uttering the famous phrase, "Alia iactuisti," the die is cast. He gave the order. His 13th Legion crossed the Rubicon, effectively igniting a civil war that would consume the Roman world. This single act is one of the most iconic and controversial in history. To understand the controversy, we must look at it from both sides of the river. From Caesar's perspective, this was not an act of ambition but of necessity. The Roman Republic was already broken. It was crippled by corruption, dominated by a small clique of aristocratic families who used violence and bribery to maintain their power, utterly ignoring the plight of the common people and the veterans Caesar represented. In his view, the Senate had become so corrupt it had forfeited its moral authority. His crossing was a desperate bid to force through the reforms he believed were necessary to save the Republic from itself, to clear out the rot and restore a measure of justice. He was not marching against Rome, but for a better version of it. Yet, from the perspective of his opponents in the Senate, this was the ultimate proof of everything they had feared. Caesar was a traitor, a power-hungry demagogue willing to tear the entire state apart to satisfy his own ego and avoid standing trial. They saw not a reformer but a would-be king, a dictator in the making who valued his personal dignitas, his honor and status above the sacred laws and traditions of 500 years of republican rule. By crossing the Rubicon, he wasn't saving the republic, he was delivering its death blow, replacing the rule of law with the rule of the sword, and setting a precedent that would eventually lead to the imperial system. The truth, as always, likely lies somewhere in the murky middle. Caesar was both a reformer with a vision for a more efficient and inclusive Rome, and a supremely ambitious man who could not tolerate being second to anyone. His decision was a calculated gamble that the system was too weak to stop him. The immediate aftermath proved him right. His bold move caught the Senate and Pompey completely by surprise. They had underestimated his speed and the loyalty of his troops. Expecting to have months to prepare, they instead panicked and fled Rome, abandoning the capital to Caesar without a fight. This civil war would rage for 4 years across the entire Mediterranean, from the hills of Spain to the deserts of Egypt, and while Caesar emerged victorious, his victory was short-lived. He was assassinated just 5 years later by senators who believed they were liberating the Republic from a tyrant, a tragic irony, because his crossing of the Rubicon had already made the restoration of the old Republic an impossibility. From one republic-shattering river crossing, we now turn to a decision that would forge a new spiritual landscape for the entire Western world. Just a few centuries after Nero had scapegoated Christians as public enemies, a Roman emperor would make the astonishing choice not just to tolerate them, but to place their faith at the very heart of imperial power. The year is 313 CE, and the emperor is Constantine I, later known as Constantine the Great. After years of brutal civil war, he shared control of the vast Roman Empire with his co-emperor Licinius. In the city of Milan, they issued a joint proclamation that would become known as the Edict of Milan, and its contents were nothing short of revolutionary. The edict declared that henceforth the Roman Empire would adopt a policy of universal religious toleration. It specifically mentioned Christians, stating they could now openly practice their faith without fear of persecution, and it ordered the return of all property that had been confiscated from Christian communities during earlier waves of violence. After nearly 3 centuries of being hunted, executed in arenas, and used as human torches, Christians could suddenly worship in broad daylight. Their churches were legally recognized, and their leaders gained unprecedented access to the halls of power. This was more than a policy shift. It was a complete inversion of the Roman world's spiritual hierarchy. The controversy that has echoed through history lies in Constantine's motivation. Why would a traditionally pagan Roman emperor who traced his authority back to Jupiter and Mars suddenly embrace the god of a once persecuted minority? The traditional story, promoted by Christian writers like Eusebius, is that Constantine experienced a profound divine vision. On the eve of the decisive battle of the Milvian Bridge in 312 CE against his rival Maxentius, he reportedly saw a cross of light in the sky above the sun, inscribed with the Greek words Epsilon nu tau omicron upsilon tau letter 1 ff3 nu y iota kappa alpha. In this sign conquer. That night, Christ himself appeared to Constantine in a dream and instructed him to place the Chi-Rho symbol, the first 2 letters of Christ's name in Greek, on the shields of his soldiers. Constantine obeyed, won a stunning victory against overwhelming odds, and from that moment on became a devoted follower of the Christian God. This narrative paints the picture of a genuine conversion, a ruler humbled and transformed by a direct encounter with the divine. It suggests the Edict of Milan was an act of sincere faith, a repayment of a debt to the God who had granted him victory and the empire. The profound personal conviction theory is powerfully seductive, and it aligns with Constantine's later deep involvement in church affairs, such as calling the Council of Nicaea to settle theological disputes. However, many historians propose a far more pragmatic political explanation. By the early 4th century, the Roman Empire was fracturing. It had been divided into pieces ruled by different emperors, and decades of civil war, economic crisis, and foreign invasion had shattered the old sense of unity. The traditional pagan religions were deeply tied to individual cities and old aristocratic families. They didn't offer a universal system that could bind together such a vast and diverse empire. Christianity, in contrast, was a compelling alternative. It was a highly organized international community that transcended ethnic and social boundaries. It taught obedience to authority and offered a message of hope and order that was desperately attractive in a chaotic age. From this perspective, Constantine wasn't just a convert, he was the ultimate political strategist. He recognized that the Christian Church, with its network of bishops and its committed followers, could serve as a powerful new glue to hold the crumbling empire together. Legalizing Christianity wasn't about faith. It was about co-opting a robust and growing administrative structure to bolster his own power and create a unified state religion that answered to him. His subsequent actions support this. He kept the title of Pontifex Maximus, the high priest of the pagan state religion, and his coins continued to feature pagan symbols for years after Milvian Bridge. His support seemed to be less about personal belief and more about harnessing a useful tool for social control. The true motivation likely rests in a blend of both views. Constantine was likely a man of his superstitious time, genuinely attributing his incredible luck and military success to the favor of some powerful divine force. But he was also a brilliant, ruthless politician who would never let piety get in the way of practical power. He probably saw the Christian God as the most potent deity available, and aligning with his followers was a masterstroke of realpolitik. Regardless of his motives, the long-term effects of his decision were nothing less than earth-shattering. Almost overnight, Christianity moved from the catacombs to the palace. The church gained immense wealth, legal privileges, and eventually a monopoly on state power. This fusion of spiritual and temporal authority created the model for the entire medieval world, shaping the course of art, architecture, law, and philosophy for over 1,000 years. The very cultural and intellectual foundations of Western civilization were built upon this moment. Yet, this union also had a dark side. With state power came state interference, and Christianity itself was transformed from a persecuted sect into a sometimes persecuting institution. The age of martyrs gave way to the age of heresy hunts and religious wars, a bitter irony born from an emperor's controversial choice to welcome a once outlawed faith into the heart of his empire. From the grand, empire-shaping decisions of emperors, we now turn to a story of raw, visceral defiance from the edge of the Roman world. In the misty lands of Britannia, a client king of the Iceni tribe died, leaving his kingdom jointly to the Roman Emperor Nero and his own 2 daughters. His wife, Boudica, was a queen who expected to rule in her own right and preserve her people's sovereignty. The Romans, however, saw things differently. To them, Britannia was conquered territory, and client kingdoms were mere temporary arrangements on the path to full annexation. Roman officials descended on the Iceni lands to enforce this new reality. According to the ancient historians Tacitus and Cassius Dio, what happened next was an act of unspeakable brutality. The Romans publicly flogged Boudica and then raped her 2 young daughters. This personal and political humiliation was the spark that ignited a firestorm. Boudica's decision to respond not with pleas but with a call to total war was a watershed moment. She rallied not only her own Iceni warriors but also the neighboring Trinovantes tribe, who were seething with their own grievances against the Romans, particularly over the heavy taxes and the arrogant seizure of their lands for veteran settlements. The Roman governor, Suetonius Paulinus, was far to the west, campaigning on the island of Anglesey, crushing the Druidic stronghold there. The province was left virtually undefended, and Boudica saw her moment. She led a colossal army. Dio claims it numbered 230,000, on a bloody march of vengeance. Their first target was Camulogenum, modern-day Colchester. This was no mere military outpost. It was a colonia, a settlement for retired Roman legionaries. It stood as a blatant symbol of Roman oppression, built on land confiscated from the local tribes. The city was poorly defended, and the rebels overwhelmed it, tearing down the newly built temple to the deified Emperor Claudius and slaughtering everyone inside. The Roman Ninth Legion, rushing to the rescue, was ambushed and annihilated. Only the cavalry escaped. Emboldened by this victory, Boudica's force swept south towards Londinium. Londinium was not a large city by our standards, but it was a thriving commercial hub, the heart of Roman trade and administration in Britain. Suetonius Paulinus, having raced back from Wales, made a chilling calculation. He assessed his limited forces and decided the city was indefensible. He made the controversial choice to abandon it, sacrificing its inhabitants to save his army for a future battle. He urged those who could to flee with him. Those who remained, the elderly, the poor, the merchants who refused to abandon their goods, faced the full, terrifying fury of the rebel army. Tacitus and Dio describe a scene of absolute carnage. Londinium was reduced to ash and rubble. Every single person was killed, with no distinction made for age or gender. The same fate befell the next town, Verulamium, modern St. Albans. The archaeological record chillingly confirms these accounts. Beneath modern London, archaeologists have found a distinct, thick red layer of burnt debris dating to this exact period, dubbed the Boudican destruction layer. In Colchester, the evidence is even more haunting. A burned-down warehouse contained the remains of entire families who tried to hide from the violence, their bones fused together by the intense heat. This brings us to the central, enduring controversy of Boudica's revolt. Was this a righteous war of liberation against a cruel and invasive imperial power? From this perspective, Boudica is a national heroine, a freedom fighter who took a stand against unimaginable personal and political violence. Her decision to fight was a legitimate response to Roman treachery and atrocity. The destruction of the cities was a necessary tactic to demoralize the enemy, destroy their economic base, and inspire other tribes to join the cause. She was fighting not just for her throne, but for the very survival of her culture against an empire that showed no mercy. The opposing view, however, questions the morality of her methods. While her cause may have been just, the rebellion's extreme brutality arguably tipped into indiscriminate slaughter. The Romans recorded that 70,000 Romans and pro-Roman Britons were killed in the three cities. This was not a surgical strike against military targets. It was the eradication of entire civilian populations. This savagery, while understandable as rage-fueled retaliation, ultimately played into Roman hands. It allowed Suetonius Paulinus to frame the conflict not as a political rebellion, but as a barbarian uprising that needed to be crushed to protect civilization itself. It hardened Roman resolve and may have discouraged other tribes from joining her, fearing both her wrath and the inevitable Roman retaliation. The final act came at a battle whose location remains unknown, somewhere in the British Midlands. Suetonius, a brilliant tactician, chose a narrow defile with a wooded rear protecting his flanks. He arrayed his 10,000 legionaries in a tight, disciplined line, while Boudica's massive force, confident from their victories, charged headlong into the Roman killing zone. The lack of maneuverability worked against them. Their numbers became a liability. The Romans' volleys of javelins, followed by a shield wall advance, turned the battle into a slaughter. Tacitus claims the Romans killed 80,000 Britons for the loss of only 400 of their own men. Upon hearing of the defeat, Boudica allegedly took poison rather than be captured and paraded through Rome. The aftermath was predictably grim. The Romans launched a vicious campaign of retribution across the countryside, starving and punishing the tribes into submission. Boudica's decision to revolt remains one of history's most powerful examples of the desperation resistance can inspire. Her legacy is a paradox, a symbol of fierce national pride and the fight for freedom. yet also a cautionary tale about the cyclical nature of violence and the grim, calculated reality of imperial power. She chose to answer cruelty with fury, and for a brief, terrifying moment she made the might of Rome tremble. But in the end, her flame, though incredibly bright, burned out quickly, leaving the Romans to rebuild their cities on a foundation of ash and bones, their grip on Britannia tighter and more unforgiving than ever before. After the ferocious, fiery revolt of Boudica, which challenged Rome with raw force, we now turn to a leader who conquered an empire not just with the sword, but with a startlingly different philosophy. In the 6th century BCE, a new power surged out of the rugged lands of Persia, led by a king whose name would become synonymous with visionary rule, Cyrus II, known to history as Cyrus the Great. Through brilliant military campaigns, he forged the Achaemenid Empire, the largest the world had yet seen, stretching from the Indus River to the Aegean Sea. But his most lasting legacy wasn't the territory he captured, it was the revolutionary way he chose to govern it. Previous empires, like the brutal Assyrians, maintained control through a policy of terror. Defeated populations were often massacred, deported en masse, and scattered across distant lands to break their cultural spirit and prevent rebellion. Their gods were mocked, their temples destroyed, their identities erased. Cyrus looked upon this model and saw its weakness. A people stripped of everything have nothing left to lose, and their simmering hatred makes them a constant source of instability. So he devised a radical alternative: conquest through conciliation. His most famous act, detailed in the biblical book of Ezra and corroborated by an incredible archaeological find known as the Cyrus Cylinder, was his treatment of the Jewish people. Decades earlier, the Babylonians under King Nebuchadnezzar had destroyed Jerusalem, burned the great Temple of Solomon to the ground, and forced the city's elite into exile in Babylon. They lived there as captives, longing for their homeland but powerless to return. Upon conquering Babylon in 539 BCE, Cyrus issued a proclamation that must have seemed miraculous to them. He not only permitted the Jewish exiles to return to Jerusalem, he funded the reconstruction of their temple and returned the sacred vessels that had been looted from it. He presented himself not as a destroyer but as a liberator chosen by their own God, Yahweh, to restore them to their home. The Cyrus Cylinder, a small, barrel-shaped clay artifact inscribed in Akkadian cuneiform, lays out this general policy. It declares that Cyrus restored the gods of all the conquered peoples to their own sanctuaries and allowed them to live in peace. He encouraged the return of displaced populations to their homelands. In an age where a king's glory was measured by the gods he captured and the enemies he humiliated, this was a breathtaking inversion of the established order. This brings us to the central controversy that historians still debate. Was Cyrus the Great history's first enlightened ruler, a genuinely tolerant leader who respected the cultural and religious diversity of his subjects? This view paints him as a philosopher king, a man ahead of his time who understood that a stable empire is built on the consent of the governed, not just their fear. The biblical texts hail him as a Messiah, the anointed one of God. This perspective suggests his policy was born of a profound wisdom and a unique respect for human dignity. The alternative, more pragmatic view sees this not as benevolence but as the ultimate strategic genius. From this angle, Cyrus was the master architect of soft power. By allowing conquered peoples to keep their gods, their customs, and their leaders, he gave them a stake in the stability of the Persian Empire. A priest in Judah or a merchant in Babylon would reason that life under the Persians was not so bad. In fact, it was far better than the alternative. This policy effectively neutered the primary cause of rebellion before it could even begin. It made administration cheaper and more efficient, as local elites handled most governance themselves under the watchful eye of a Persian satrap or governor. The empire could expand to an unprecedented size because it didn't fight to impose a single, homogenizing culture. It was a brilliant, calculated system of control disguised as generosity, ensuring loyalty through gratitude rather than through sheer oppression. The truth likely incorporates both views. Cyrus was undoubtedly a shrewd strategist, but his methods were so consistently applied across his vast domains that they suggest a core governing philosophy, not just a one-off tactical move. His innovation created a model of imperialism that would be studied and emulated for centuries. The stability of his empire allowed for an unprecedented era of trade, communication, and cultural exchange across the known world. The Royal Road, a magnificent highway system, connected his territories, fostering an exchange of ideas from India to Greece. In the end, Cyrus's controversial decision redefined what it meant to be a conqueror. He demonstrated that the greatest power isn't always the ability to destroy, but the wisdom to build. He built an empire where many cultures could coexist, not as equals, but with a measure of self-determination that was unheard of in the ancient world. His legacy is a complex tapestry woven with threads of genuine humanitarianism and cold, calculated realpolitik, a combination so effective that it allowed his empire to thrive long after he was gone, setting a standard that would challenge every expansionist power that followed. From the enlightened statecraft of Cyrus the Great, we now plunge into the depths of what appears to be absolute insanity at the heart of the Roman Empire. A few decades after the death of Jesus, the young Emperor Gaius, better known by his childhood nickname Caligula, or Little Boots, stood on a beach in northern Gaul, likely near modern-day Boulogne. His legions were arrayed behind him, prepared for a campaign against the elusive Britons. But instead of giving the order to embark, he presented them with a command so baffling it has echoed through history as the ultimate example of tyrannical madness. He declared war on the sea itself, and by extension, its divine ruler, the god Neptune. According to the scandalous biographies written by the historian Suetonius decades later, Caligula marched his soldiers onto the shore, lined them up in battle formation, and had them unleash a volley of their javelins and arrows into the waves. He then commanded them to wade into the water and collect seashells in their helmets and the folds of their tunics. These shells, he proclaimed, were the spoils of the ocean, loot plundered from the sea god himself, as valuable as the treasures of any conquered nation. To commemorate this great victory, he ordered the construction of a massive lighthouse, a permanent monument to his conquest of the Channel. On its surface, this seems like the unmistakable behavior of a deranged mind, a man who had fully lost his grip on reality. Caligula's reign is littered with such stories, appointing his favorite horse Incitatus as a consul, holding conversations with the moon, and committing acts of extreme cruelty and depravity. For centuries, this event has been held up as proof positive of his insanity, the final nail in the coffin of his reputation as Rome's most unhinged emperor. But what if there was a method to this apparent madness? A growing number of modern historians argue that we've been reading this story far too literally. To understand the potential logic, we must look at the context. Caligula's legions in Gaul were notoriously rebellious. They had been stationed there for years, growing restless and undisciplined. Their previous commander had been involved in a major mutiny, and they were now being ordered to cross the treacherous English Channel to invade Britain, a daunting prospect that filled the superstitious soldiers with dread. A mutiny was brewing, a direct challenge to the emperor's authority. From this perspective, Caligula's war on Neptune wasn't a psychotic break, but a brilliantly cruel piece of political theater. By ordering his soldiers to perform this ridiculous and humiliating task, he wasn't declaring war on the sea, he was declaring war on their cowardice. He was publicly mocking their reluctance to sail. Collecting seashells was a symbolic act, shaming them for preferring to gather trivial trophies on the beach rather than earning real glory in battle. The entire spectacle was a calculated insult, designed to break their rebellious spirit by exposing it to ridicule. The lighthouse, then, wasn't a monument to a naval victory, but a permanent reminder of their shame and his absolute power to command them to do anything, no matter how absurd. The controversy, therefore, hinges entirely on our interpretation of Caligula's mental state. Was he a clinical lunatic suffering from a condition like encephalitis or schizophrenia, which some historians have theorized based on reports of his severe headaches and insomnia? In this case, the Neptune story is a straightforward account of a delusional man who believed he could conquer the ocean. Or was he a sadistic and arrogant young man who understood power dynamics perfectly? He may have been sane but simply evil, a narcissist who enjoyed inventing ever more creative ways to humiliate and control those around him, demonstrating that his will was so absolute it could even bend the logic of the world itself. His actions were not those of a madman, but of a tyrant performing his own omnipotence. The truth is frustratingly buried beneath layers of hostile propaganda. Our main sources, Suetonius and Cassius Dio, wrote long after Caligula's assassination, under emperors who had a vested interest in painting him as a monster to justify his murder and legitimize their own rule. They collected every salacious rumor and anecdote they could find. Separating fact from political slander is nearly impossible. The Seychelles incident sits right at this crossroads. It is so outlandish that it feels like it must be true, yet it also fits perfectly the pattern of a tyrant's performative cruelty. Whether an act of madness or malice, the decision had real consequences. It shattered the morale of the legions he needed to command, wasted enormous resources, and became the ultimate symbol of a reign that had spiraled out of control. It was a short time after this event that Caligula was assassinated by his own guards, a fate that perhaps awaited any emperor who forgot that his power, however great, still relied on the consent of the men who held the swords. His war on Neptune remains one of history's most bizarre and controversial choices, a moment that challenges us to decide where the line lies between genius and insanity, and whether the stories of monsters are ever just that, stories told by the victors. While Caligula's story represents a descent into what many saw as madness, our next decision shows a leader moving in the complete opposite direction toward a radical embrace of peace. From the chaotic shores of Gaul, we travel to the lush, vibrant plains of ancient India, where a young emperor named Ashoka stood surveying a scene of unimaginable horror. It was the year 261 BCE, and he had just won the greatest military victory of his life. His army had conquered the independent kingdom of Kalinga, a prosperous region on the east coast of the subcontinent. But the cost of this triumph was ghastly. The ancient inscriptions he would later commission tell us that 100,000 people were killed in the fighting, and another 150,000 were deported from their homes. The rivers ran red, the air was thick with the cries of the dying and the mourning, and the land was utterly desolated. Ashoka had achieved his strategic goal. He had completed the expansion of the mighty Mauryan Empire, making it the largest empire India would see for over 1,000 years. But as he walked through the carnage, something inside him shattered. The glory of conquest turned to ashes in his mouth. In his own words, recorded on Rock Edict 13, he describes his profound remorse. "What have I done? If this is a victory, what's a defeat then? Is this a victory or a defeat? Is this justice or injustice? Is it glory or shame?" This moment of intense crisis sparked one of the most dramatic personal and political transformations in world history. Ashoka made the breathtaking decision to renounce war forever. He publicly converted to Buddhism, embraced its principle of ahimsa, or non-violence, and devoted the rest of his life and his immense power to spreading a message of compassion, tolerance, and righteous conduct, which he called Dhamma. He didn't just keep this change to himself. He had his new philosophy carved into stone pillars and rock faces across his vast empire, from the mountains of Afghanistan to the jungles of South India. These Ashokan edicts are not religious sermons. They are practical guides for ethical living and good governance. They instructed officials to be fair and humane, promoted respect for parents and elders, encouraged religious tolerance between all sects, and mandated the protection of animals and the environment. He built hospitals for people and animals alike, dug wells, and planted shade trees along roads for travelers. He even sent his own son and daughter as Buddhist missionaries to spread the message of peace as far as Sri Lanka and the Hellenistic kingdoms to the west. This extraordinary pivot presents us with a compelling historical controversy that resonates deeply even today. Was Ashoka's conversion a genuine, profound moral awakening, one of the earliest and most powerful examples of a ruler's conscience being seared by the horrors of war? The evidence for this view is powerful. The raw emotion in his edicts feels too personal, too anguished to be purely political theater. His detailed administrative orders for kindness and welfare programs suggest a deep, sincere commitment to transforming his society from a culture of conquest to one of care. He didn't just talk about non-violence, he systematically dismantled the apparatus of imperial aggression, reducing royal hunting trips, a key military training exercise, and eventually apparently disbanding his army altogether. This was a man who seemed to have truly looked into the abyss and recoiled in horror. Yet the skeptical view offers a different, more pragmatic interpretation. Could this have been the most brilliant public relations campaign in ancient history? From this angle, the Kalinga War, while bloody, had also been incredibly destabilizing. The massive death toll and deportation created a resentful, restive population in a strategically crucial region. By adopting Buddhism, a faith already growing in popularity among merchants and urban elites, Ashoka was perhaps co-opting a powerful social movement. His message of Dhamma wasn't just about ethics, it was a sophisticated tool of soft power. It provided a unifying imperial ideology that could help administer a wildly diverse empire without constant military repression. It encouraged obedience to the king not out of fear, but out of a shared moral code. In this light, his pillars were less about conscience and more about control, an ancient version of spin designed to consolidate his rule and secure his legacy after a campaign that had proven too brutal even by the standards of the time. The impact of his decision on the Mauryan Empire is as debated as his motives. Did this radical pacifism actually weaken his state, making it vulnerable to future invasions and contributing to the empire's relatively rapid collapse after his death? A traditional view of history suggests that empires are maintained by strength, and Ashoka's rejection of this principle may have sown the seeds of decline. However, another perspective argues that his policies created a long period of internal stability and prosperity, fostering trade and cultural exchange across Asia. His patronage was also instrumental in transforming Buddhism from a minor Indian sect into a major world religion that would eventually spread across Asia. Perhaps the truest measure of Ashoka's legacy is not in the fate of his dynasty, but in the enduring power of his example. He remains a foundational figure in the Indian identity, his lion capital emblem adopted as the national seal of the modern republic. His story forces us to ask a difficult question: can a ruler truly wield power with compassion? Can an empire be built on a foundation of non-violence? Ashoka's controversial decision to try remains a powerful, haunting experiment, a testament to the idea that even those who hold the absolute power to inflict suffering might still choose instead to heal. Yet for all the philosophical weight of Ashoka's transformation, the relentless engine of empire often ran on a far more primal fuel: the burning need for revenge and the relentless pursuit of glory. This brings us to one of the most colossal military endeavors of the ancient world, a campaign of almost mythological scale born from a son's desire to finish his father's war. In 480 BCE, the new Persian king of kings, Xerxes I, stood at the head of an army and navy so vast that, according to the Greek historian Herodotus, it drank entire rivers dry. His goal was the subjugation of the fractious, defiant city-states of Greece. This was not merely a war of conquest, it was a deeply personal mission of vengeance. A decade earlier, at the Battle of Marathon, the Greeks had handed his father, Darius the Great, a stunning and humiliating defeat. The Persian Empire, the greatest power on earth, had been bloodied by a relatively small coalition of Athenian hoplites. For Darius, this loss was an unforgivable insult that demanded a response, but he died before he could launch his second invasion. The duty and the obsession passed to his son. Xerxes saw the invasion as a strategic necessity to secure the western flank of his empire from these unpredictable and belligerent states. But it was also about something far more powerful, Izzat, a Persian concept encompassing honor, prestige, and faith. To let the Athenian insult stand unchallenged was to show weakness, and weakness in an ancient empire was an invitation for rebellion everywhere. The invasion was therefore presented as a righteous campaign to restore the dignity of the Persian crown. The scale of his undertaking is almost impossible to overstate. This was less a military campaign and more a moving nation. Ancient sources, though likely exaggerated, speak of a force numbering in the millions, supported by a navy of over 1,000 warships. The real number was certainly in the hundreds of thousands, still an astronomical figure for the time. To solve the immense logistical challenge of supplying such a host, his engineers performed miracles. They dug a canal across the Athos Peninsula to avoid the treacherous storms that had wrecked his father's fleet years before. They built not one, but two breathtaking pontoon bridges across the Hellespont Strait, tethering hundreds of ships together with ropes of papyrus and flax to form a road from Asia into Europe. When a storm destroyed the first bridges, Xerxes reportedly had the waters themselves whipped and branded with hot irons as punishment for their insolence, a story that perfectly captures the immense, almost godlike arrogance attributed to him. This brings us to the core controversy that has surrounded his decision for 2,500 years. Was Xerxes a megalomaniacal ruler, wildly overconfident and blinded by hubris, leading a bloated and unwieldy force to its inevitable doom? The Greek perspective, which has heavily influenced our view, certainly paints this picture. They saw him as the archetypal Eastern despot, a tyrant whose pride led him to defy the natural order, attempting to conquer the free men of Greece only to be humbled by their superior courage and cunning. The sheer size of his army is presented not as a strength, but as a comical weakness, a slow, clumsy giant that could be outmaneuvered by nimbler, more motivated defenders. Or was this a calculated and, for its time, perfectly logical application of overwhelming force? From the Persian viewpoint, the strategy made sense. The goal was not just to defeat Greek armies in the field, but to utterly overwhelm them, to demonstrate such incontestable power that other city-states would surrender without a fight. This shock and awe tactic had worked for his predecessors. The mere sight of this endless multicultural host with its cavalry from Central Asia, its archers from Ethiopia, and its infantry from every corner of the empire was meant to paralyze the enemy with fear. For much of the campaign, it worked brilliantly. Northern Greece, including the powerful state of Thessaly, submitted without resistance. The Persian navy dominated the coast. The strategy was terrifyingly effective until it reached its first major bottleneck, the Pass of Thermopylae. There, the legend of the 300 Spartans was born. While the heroic last stand of King Leonidas and his men is rightly celebrated for its courage, its true military significance was as a delaying action. It held up the massive Persian army for crucial days and, more importantly, proved to the rest of Greece that the Persian colossus could be bloodied. It was a psychological turning point. The real death blow to Xerxes' campaign, however, came at sea. Lured into the narrow straits of Salamis, the vast Persian navy lost its greatest advantage, its numbers. Unable to maneuver, its ships became tangled together, sitting ducks for the heavier, more robust Greek triremes that rammed and sank them by the score. From his golden throne on the slopes of Mount Aegilio, Xerxes watched his dreams of conquest literally go down in flames. The defeat at Salamis forced him to retreat to Asia, leaving behind a large army to continue the fight. That force was defeated the following year at the Battle of Plataea, ending the invasion for good. The controversy of Xerxes' decision is ultimately a lesson in the limits of power. He represents the eternal dilemma of overreach. Did he fail because his plan was fundamentally flawed, or because of a few critical mistakes and a dose of bad luck? His invasion, for all its ultimate failure, was a breathtaking display of imperial organization and ambition. It was a gamble on a scale no one had ever attempted, a decision that reshaped the destiny of Greece and, by extension, the entire Western world. Had he succeeded, the cultural flowering of classical Greece, the birth of democracy, philosophy, and drama, might have been snuffed out before it ever truly began. His failure ensured that a very different idea of civilization would have the chance to grow. Leaving behind the sun-bleached shores of Salamis and the colossal ambitions of Xerxes, we find ourselves transported to a very different kind of isolation, one not born of military defeat, but of a deep personal disillusionment with power itself. In the year 26 CE, the Roman Emperor Tiberius, then in his late 60s, made a decision that stunned the empire and has puzzled historians ever since. He announced he was leaving Rome, the heart of the world, and withdrawing permanently to the secluded, breathtakingly beautiful island of Capri, a place of jagged cliffs and serene blue grottos that felt a world away from the choking intrigue of the capital. He would never set foot in Rome again. On the surface, this seemed like the ultimate dereliction of duty. An emperor's power was meant to be personal, visible. He was expected to preside over the Senate, lead armies, judge cases, and be seen by the people at the games and in the forums. By physically removing himself, Tiberius was breaking a fundamental contract of Roman rule. But to understand this controversial choice, we have to look at the man himself and the toxic environment he was fleeing. Tiberius was never meant to be emperor. A brilliant but dour and deeply private military commander, he was thrust into the role by the machinations of his mother, Livia, and the death of Rome's beloved first emperor, Augustus. He was an introvert forced onto history's most extroverted stage. For over a decade, he had dutifully played the part, but he was deeply unpopular with the Senate, who saw him as cold and arrogant, and with the people, who found him lacking the charm of his predecessor. The ancient historian Tacitus paints a picture of a man worn down by paranoia, grief, and sheer exhaustion. He had survived countless plots, seen family members and friends die under suspicious circumstances, and witnessed the relentless, sycophantic hypocrisy of the Roman elite. His trusted son, Drusus, had died a few years earlier, and many whispered he had been poisoned. The capital had become a snake pit of informers and flatterers, all jockeying for influence. For a man of Tiberius's temperament, this wasn't just unpleasant, it was unbearable. His retreat to Capri, therefore, can be seen as a desperate act of self-preservation. From his fortified villas perched on the cliffs, he could breathe. He could engage in his scholarly pursuits away from the constant, judging eyes of the Roman aristocracy. He could rule through written correspondence and trusted officials, theoretically maintaining control without having to endure the daily theater of court politics. In this light, his decision was a rational, if extreme, strategy to protect his sanity and his power by creating a buffer between himself and the sources of his misery. However, this physical and emotional distance created a vacuum of power in Rome, and nature abhors a vacuum. Into that void stepped a man named Lucius Aelius Sejanus, the ambitious and ruthlessly efficient commander of the Praetorian Guard. With the emperor a distant figure on an island, Sejanus became the most visible source of authority in the city. He positioned himself as Tiberius's indispensable right hand, controlling the flow of information to and from Capri. Sejanus expertly played on the emperor's paranoia, feeding him reports both real and fabricated of treasonous plots within senatorial families. With Tiberius's remote approval often given through letters, Sejanus orchestrated a brutal reign of terror. Prominent citizens were accused of maiestas, treason against the emperor's majesty, a charge that became a catch-all for eliminating rivals. Properties were confiscated and families were destroyed, all while Sejanus consolidated his own power, aiming for nothing less than the throne itself. This is where the controversy deepens into a dark chasm. Was Tiberius's withdrawal a catastrophic failure of leadership that unleashed a monster upon Rome? Critics argue that by isolating himself, he abandoned his most fundamental duty, to be present, to see the truth for himself, and to protect his people from predatory officials. His absence allowed Sejanus's conspiracy to fester and grow to monstrous proportions because there was no one at the center to check his lies. The emperor became a gullible recluse, signing death warrants based on the whispered calumnies of a man he thought he could trust. The bloody purges that followed were, in this view, a direct result of his neglect. Yet another perspective suggests this was all part of a chillingly cynical, long-game strategy. Perhaps Tiberius wasn't a duped hermit but a master manipulator using Sejanus as a weapon. From the safety of Capri, he could let his hated prefect do the dirty work of cleansing the Senate of his enemies, all while his own hands appeared clean. When Sejanus finally overreached and his ambition became too obvious, Tiberius moved with cool precision to destroy him. In a dramatic scene relayed by the historian Cassius Dio, a letter from the emperor was read aloud in the Senate, beginning with praise for Sejanus and slowly, agonizingly turning to condemn him to death. Sejanus was arrested on the spot and executed, his body torn apart by a mob. This interpretation paints Tiberius not as negligent, but as ruthlessly pragmatic, using distance and a proxy to achieve what he could not do openly. And then there are the stories that have forever stained his reputation, the rumors recorded by Suetonius of unspeakable depravity in his cliffside villas. Tales of orgies, sexual perversions, and cruel entertainments involving young men and women, known as his spintrii. These salacious accounts have defined the popular image of Tiberius on Capri for 2,000 years. But how much truth is there to them? Most modern historians view these stories with extreme skepticism, likely originating from the venomous propaganda spread by his political enemies after his death. They are the classic accusations leveled against a reclusive, unpopular ruler who is no longer around to defend himself. They serve as a metaphor for the perceived moral decay that festered in the darkness away from the public eye of Rome. The true tragedy of Tiberius's retirement is that it accomplished neither peace nor effective rule. His attempt to find a safe haven only magnified the very pathologies he sought to escape. The isolation he craved became a cage that imprisoned him in his own paranoia, and the distance he created became the conduit through which tyranny flowed unchecked into the heart of the empire. His controversial decision stands as an eternal lesson in the perils of power divorced from presence, and a warning that when a leader retreats into the shadows, it is rarely virtue that grows in the light they leave behind. While Tiberius sought to hide from power on the secluded cliffs of Capri, another ancient leader took a radically different approach to securing her throne, not by retreating from her identity, but by completely reconstructing it in the most public way possible. In the fiercely masculine world of ancient Egypt's New Kingdom, a royal woman named Hatshepsut accomplished the unimaginable. She didn't just rule as a queen or a regent for her young stepson. She declared herself the one true pharaoh, the living Horus, the son of the sun god Ammon. And to cement this audacious claim, she made one of history's most visually striking decisions. She ordered that she be depicted in all official statues and temple reliefs not as a woman but as a man. This was no subtle shift. Walk through her magnificent mortuary temple at Deir el-Bahri today, and you will see her portrayed with the classic, powerful physique of a male king. broad shoulders, a bare, muscular chest, and the traditional pharaonic regalia including the Nemes headcloth and false beard. The inscriptions surrounding these images refer to her with male pronouns and titles, His Majesty, the Son of Re. Yet, in some of these very same monuments, her feminine birth name, Hatshepsut, which means foremost of noble ladies, remains clearly inscribed. This creates a fascinating duality, a ruler presenting a male body to the world while never fully erasing her female origin. This leads us directly to the central, tantalizing mystery that historians have debated for over a century. Was this cross-gender portrayal a purely pragmatic political necessity, or was it something more profound? The pragmatic argument is incredibly strong. The concept of mat divine order was the bedrock of Egyptian society. The pharaoh was the mortal embodiment of this order, a role intrinsically linked to masculinity. He was the warrior, the high priest, the earthly son of a male god. For a woman to claim this title was to potentially disrupt the very cosmic balance the Egyptians believed their ruler maintained. By adopting the male form, Hatshepsut was speaking the visual language of power that her subjects and the priesthood understood. She was fitting herself into an unchanging, divine template, assuring everyone that the natural order was intact and that she was every bit as legitimate as any male predecessor. It was the ultimate political costume, designed to preempt any challenge to her authority based on her gender. But another, more intriguing possibility exists. Could this have been an expression of a more complex personal or theological identity? Some scholars suggest that in the Egyptian worldview, the concepts of male and female were not the rigid binaries we often see them as today. Deities often combined attributes, and the pharaoh's role was itself a kind of synthesis. By presenting herself as both the daughter of a god, a traditionally female role, and the son of a god, a male, kingly role, Hatshepsut may have been presenting herself as the complete, perfected ruler encompassing all aspects of power. She wasn't denying her womanhood, she was transcending it to become something more, a divine sovereign who existed beyond mundane human categories. This wasn't deception. It was a sophisticated form of royal ideology, a statement that the spirit of kingship was so powerful it could operate through any vessel, male or female. Her reign was a stunning success. For over 20 years, she presided over a period of unprecedented peace and prosperity. She launched ambitious trading expeditions to the fabled land of Punt, bringing back gold, ivory, exotic animals, and fragrant incense trees. She commissioned a breathtaking building program, the scale of which hadn't been seen since the great pyramid builders, erecting obelisks and temples throughout Egypt. Her rule was stable, accepted, and wildly successful by any measure, which makes the final act of her story all the more puzzling. A couple of decades after her death, during the reign of her stepson Thutmose III, a systematic campaign began to obliterate her memory from history. Her statues were smashed, her elegant obelisks were walled up, and her cartouches and images were meticulously chiseled off the temple walls. For centuries, she was a forgotten footnote. The reason for this damnatio memoriae, the condemnation of memory, is another great controversy. Was it a simple, bitter act of revenge by a resentful stepson finally free to erase the woman who had usurped his throne for so long, or was it something more ideological? Perhaps Thutmose and his advisors, looking to secure a direct male lineage for future generations, felt that a successful female pharaoh was a dangerous anomaly that could not be allowed to exist in the historical record. Her very success may have been the reason for her erasure, a precedent too dangerous to remain. Hatshepsut's story is therefore a double paradox, a woman who had to become a man to be seen as a legitimate king, and a monarch so successful that her own legacy had to be violently destroyed to ensure no woman would ever dare to follow her path. Yet even Hatshepsut's calculated reshaping of her own image pales in comparison to the scale of the next leader's attempt to reshape the entire known world. After the Persian Wars, a new power rose in the north in the rugged kingdom of Macedon. Its king, Alexander III, would become known to history as Alexander the Great, and his conquest of the colossal Persian Empire was a feat of staggering military genius. But it was what he chose to do after the fighting was over that would become his most controversial and enduring legacy. Having toppled the mighty King of Kings, Darius III, Alexander faced a question no European leader had ever encountered on such a scale. How do you rule an empire of countless cultures, languages, and traditions that stretches from the shores of Greece to the banks of the Indus River? His answer was as radical as it was unprecedented. Instead of imposing a strict Macedonian hegemony, he embarked on a breathtaking policy of fusion. He began to actively encourage his veteran Macedonian soldiers to marry Persian noblewomen, and he himself set the ultimate example by taking a Persian princess, Roxana, as his wife. He adopted elements of Persian court dress, the flowing robes and the diadem, much to the horror of his loyal officers. Most shockingly, he began to integrate Persian nobles and soldiers into his army and administration, treating them not as a conquered people but as partners in a new hybrid empire. At a grand mass marriage ceremony at Susa, he formally wed dozens of his high-ranking companions to Persian brides, envisioning a new ruling class born of both European and Asian blood. This was not merely a political strategy, it was a philosophical vision. Alexander seemed to be striving for a concept he called homonoia, a unity of minds, a concord among all peoples. He founded over 20 cities bearing his name, with Alexandria in Egypt being the most famous, which were designed not as military garrisons but as melting pots. They were planned as centers of trade, learning, and cultural exchange, where Greek, Egyptian, Persian, and Indian ideas could intermingle freely. These were not outposts of Greece in a foreign land. They were intended to be the beating hearts of a new cosmopolitan world order. But this visionary policy came at a tremendous cost, and the controversy it sparked nearly tore his empire apart at the seams. To his Macedonian veterans, these were not the acts of a unifying king, but of a ruler who had lost touch with his roots. These men had followed him to the ends of the earth, fighting grueling battles under the banner of avenging the Persian invasions of Greece. They had watched their friends die to defeat the Persians, only to see their king dressing like one, marrying one, and appointing former enemies to positions of honor. In their eyes, Alexander was not building bridges, he was spitting on the graves of their fallen comrades. The growing resentment finally boiled over at a military review in the city of Opis. When Alexander announced his plan to send his Macedonian veterans home and replace them with Persian troops, the army mutinied. These hardened soldiers who had stood by him for a decade wept with fury and feelings of betrayal. Alexander's response was a masterclass in emotional manipulation, he retreating to his quarters for 3 days, shaming them into a fervent reconciliation. But the rift was never truly healed. This leaves us with the monumental question that has divided historians for millennia. Was Alexander's fusion policy the inspired blueprint of a true visionary, a man centuries ahead of his time who dreamed of erasing the arbitrary divisions between peoples? Proponents of this view see a philosopher king, a student of Aristotle attempting to put ideals into practice. They point to the incredible flourishing of the Hellenistic age that followed his death, an era of unprecedented scientific, artistic, and cultural achievement born from the blending of Greek and Eastern traditions in cities like Alexandria. His policy, they argue, laid the groundwork for a connected world, making it possible for ideas, goods, and people to flow along the routes his armies had carved. The opposing perspective views it as the ultimate vanity project of a man drunk on his own power and deification. From this angle, his actions were not about unity but about control. Incorporating the Persian elite was a pragmatic move to administer a vast territory with a limited pool of Macedonian bureaucrats, Adopting Eastern customs was a calculated performance to legitimize his rule in the eyes of his new Persian subjects, casting himself as the legitimate successor to the Achaemenid throne. The alienation of his core troops was not an unfortunate side effect, but a catastrophic strategic blunder that bred instability and sowed the seeds for the civil wars that would shatter his empire the moment he died. His dream of homonoia was a fantasy that ignored the deep-seated cultural pride and prejudices of the very people who had given him power in the first place. Alexander's grand experiment ultimately died with him. His generals, the Diadochi, divided his empire and largely abandoned his fusion policies, reasserting a more traditional Greek dominance over their subjects. Yet the cultural genie was out of the bottle. The world had been permanently changed. The network of Alexandrias he founded continued to buzz with a new hybrid energy, creating a cosmopolitan Greek-speaking world that would later provide the perfect cultural substrate for the spread of Roman power and, later, Christianity. His controversial decision stands as a powerful testament to the tension between the ideal of a unified humanity and the stubborn, messy realities of tradition, identity, and power. He dared to imagine a world without borders, but in trying to build it, he discovered that the most difficult territory to conquer is the human heart. Yet, even as Nero scapegoated the Christians, another of his monumental and wildly controversial decisions was taking physical shape amidst the smoldering ruins of Rome. With entire districts leveled by the Great Fire, the emperor saw not just tragedy but opportunity, a vast blank canvas upon which to construct his personal vision of paradise. The result was the Domus Aurea, the Golden House, an architectural marvel so opulent and sprawling that it would become the ultimate symbol of his reign and a primary catalyst for his eventual downfall. This was not merely a new palace, it was a statement of imperial power on a scale never before imagined. The complex sprawled across over 200 acres in the very heart of Rome, encompassing parts of the Palatine, Caelian, and Esquiline hills. Ancient historians like Suetonius describe a landscape of manicured countryside, vineyards, and forests populated with exotic animals, all artificially created within the city walls. At its center lay a vast colonnaded lake where the Colosseum would later stand, reflecting the palace's shimmering facade. The very name Golden House came from the brilliant gold leaf that was said to cover its extensive entrance hall, a blinding declaration of its grandeur. But the extravagance went far beyond gold. The palace was a showcase of revolutionary architectural and artistic genius. The main dining room was famously circular and constantly revolved, day and night, mimicking the motion of the heavens, a feat of engineering that must have seemed like pure magic. Ivory ceilings hid panels that could slide back to shower guests with flower petals or perfume. One of the most breathtaking innovations was the extensive use of the groin vault, an architectural technique that allowed for the creation of large, open, and well-lit spaces. These vast, barrel-vaulted rooms were not dark and cramped, but were flooded with light from strategic oculi and windows, their walls adorned with magnificent frescoes by the artist Fabulous, who worked while lying down to perfect his craft. This was a radical departure from traditional Roman design, a bold experiment in space, light, and luxury. The controversy surrounding the Domus Aurea, however, is a tale of two extremes. On one hand, it can be viewed as an unparalleled artistic and architectural triumph, a breathtaking leap forward in design that would influence Roman building for centuries. The frescoes, with their delicate, whimsical designs of figures, architecture, and flora, a style now known as grotesque after the grottos where they were later rediscovered, became a direct inspiration for Renaissance masters like Raphael. The innovative use of concrete and vaulting paved the way for the great imperial bath complexes. In this light, Nero was not a decadent monster but a visionary patron of the arts, pushing the boundaries of what was possible to create a monument of sublime beauty. The opposing perspective, the one that sealed his fate, saw the Golden House for what it truly represented to the Roman people, the grossest act of narcissistic tyranny. To build this pleasure dome, Nero seized immense tracts of public land that had been home to thousands of now homeless citizens. While they lived in makeshift shelters, their emperor was constructing a private fantasy world of impossible luxury funded by the emptied treasuries of the empire and the pillaged temples of the provinces. The most infamous anecdote recorded by Suetonius captures the public's outrage. Upon the palace's completion, Nero is said to have boastfully declared, "At last I can begin to live like a human being." For a population that had lost everything, this was not the statement of an artist. It was the gloating of a man who saw the catastrophe of his people as a personal convenience. The Domus Aurea became the physical, undeniable proof of every accusation leveled against him. It was the embodiment of his greed, his isolation from the suffering of his subjects, and his delusions of divine grandeur. It fueled the hatred of the aristocracy, whose traditional power centers were literally overshadowed by his new palace, and it broke the patience of the common people and the military. The palace, for all its genius, was a political disaster of the highest order. It provided the perfect, gleaming justification for the conspiracies that would eventually lead to his declared condemnation by the Senate and his desperate suicide. His golden dream house, a masterpiece of art and engineering, ultimately served as his most magnificent and damning tombstone. While Alexander dreamed of unifying the world and Nero built a palace for one, another emperor looked upon the sprawling, chaotic Roman Empire and concluded that it had simply become too big for one man to rule. In 285 CE, a seasoned military commander named Diocletian seized power after decades of what historians call the crisis of the 3rd century, a nightmarish 50-year period of civil war, economic collapse, foreign invasion, and rapid imperial turnover where more than 20 emperors had been murdered or killed in battle. The empire was on the verge of complete fragmentation. Diocletian's radical solution was one of the most consequential administrative decisions in history. He would cut the empire in half. This was not a partition of territory, but the creation of a new system of rule called the Tetrarchy, or Rule of Four. Diocletian first divided the empire into an eastern and a western half. He would rule the more prosperous and defensible east from the city of Nicomedia, while appointing a trusted fellow officer, Maximian, as his co-emperor or Augustus to rule the west from Milan. But he didn't stop there. A few years later, he further appointed 2 junior emperors, each with the title Caesar, to serve under the 2 Augusti. These Caesars were designated heirs, creating a clear line of succession, and were given specific regions to defend: Constantius Chlorus in Gaul and Britain, and Galerius on the volatile Danube frontier. The 4 rulers, the tetrarchs, were meant to work in concert, a college of emperors that could respond to multiple crises simultaneously across the vast frontier. It was a move away from the risky, winner-take-all dynastic system toward a meritocratic, military-style chain of command. The immediate benefits of this system were undeniable. For the first time in generations, the empire experienced stability. Diocletian and his colleagues could effectively crush internal rebellions and beat back Persian and Germanic invasions on multiple fronts without having to race a single army across the continent. He used this stability to push through sweeping reforms, overhauling the entire imperial structure. He reorganized the provincial governments into smaller, more manageable units to prevent any one governor from becoming too powerful. He attempted to fix the empire's runaway inflation by issuing the Edict on Maximum Prices, which set wage and price controls on thousands of goods and services. For a time it worked. The constant civil wars ceased and the frontiers were secured. From the brink of collapse, Diocletian had engineered a remarkable recovery. The central controversy of his decision, however, lies in its long-term consequences. Was the division a necessary, pragmatic adaptation that saved the empire from immediate collapse and gave it another century of life? Or was it the fatal admission that the idea of a unified Roman world was already dead, a move that permanently institutionalized a split and made the eventual fall of the West inevitable? Proponents of the first view argue that Diocletian was a brilliant realist. He recognized that the challenges of governing an empire stretching from the moors of Scotland to the deserts of Egypt were simply beyond the logistical and administrative capabilities of a single central authority, especially in an age of slow communication and constant threat. The Tetrarchy was a workable management solution for a superstate in crisis. It ended the cycle of violent succession disputes by providing a clear, planned transition of power. By stationing emperors closer to the frontiers, it made the empire more responsive and defensible. In this light, his reforms didn't weaken the empire, they were the only thing that could have saved it. The opposing perspective sees his actions as the beginning of the end. By formally dividing the empire, Diocletian shattered the centuries-old dream of Romania, a single, united Roman world. He created two separate armies, two separate administrations, and two separate courts, which inevitably began to develop different priorities, cultures, and even economies. The richer, more urbanized East, with its ancient cities and trade routes, began to pull away from the more rural, vulnerable West. The Tetrarchy itself proved fragile the moment Diocletian, the system's architect, voluntarily retired in 305 CE. His planned succession immediately broke down, plunging the empire back into a bloody civil war from which Constantine the Great would eventually emerge as the sole ruler. Although Constantine reunified the empire, he kept the concept of a separate eastern capital at Constantinople, cementing the East-West divide. The ultimate proof for critics came just over a century later. When the Western Roman Empire faced its final crisis in the 4th and 5th centuries, overwhelmed by migrations, bankrupted, and militarily exhausted, the Eastern Roman Empire, which we now call the Byzantine Empire, did not pour all of its resources into saving it. It had its own borders to protect and its own interests to pursue. The division had created a separate entity that could survive the fall of its twin. Diocletian's controversial decision therefore stands as a monumental historical what if. Did his drastic surgery save the patient's life, or did it simply allow the Eastern half to thrive while the Western half slowly bled out? He stabilized the empire for his time, but in doing so, he may have made the permanent dissolution of that unified world an unavoidable reality. But just as Diocletian's division was a grand strategic calculation, our next story is one of a desperate, grassroots gamble for freedom that almost brought the Republic to its knees. In the dusty training grounds of a gladiatorial school in Capua, a Thracian slave named Spartacus sparked a fire that would become the Third Servile War. What began as a breakout of 78 gladiators rapidly swelled into a massive army of tens of thousands of escaped slaves, a ragged but fiercely determined force that humiliated legion after legion sent to crush them. For 2 years, this rebel army roamed the Italian countryside, undefeated, a living nightmare for the Roman slave-owning elite. Then, in the autumn of 72 BCE, they stood at a crossroads in every sense of the word. Having fought their way north, they reached the foothills of the Alps. The path to freedom, to their homelands in Gaul and Thrace, lay open before them. The Alps, which had once nearly destroyed Hannibal's army, were now a gateway to liberty. And then, in a move that has baffled historians for centuries, Spartacus and his men turned around. They abandoned their escape route and marched south back into the very heart of the Roman territory they had fought so hard to leave. This decision is one of the great unresolved mysteries of the ancient world, and the controversy hinges on what was happening within the rebel ranks. The most widely accepted theory, based on the accounts of the historians Plutarch and Appian, points to crippling internal division. The slave army was not a monolithic force. It was a fragile coalition of men from different nations: Thracians, Gauls, Germans, and others, each with their own leaders and conflicting goals. For many, the objective had always been simple: escape Italy and return home. For others, the taste of freedom had fermented into a thirst for something more: vengeance and plunder. According to this narrative, a large faction, perhaps led by Spartacus's fellow commander Crixus, refused to cross the Alps. They were intoxicated by their success and wanted to continue raiding the rich Italian countryside, to make the Romans pay for years of their own servitude. Faced with the prospect of his army splitting apart, Spartacus may have made the fateful choice to keep them united by acquiescing to the more aggressive faction, turning south to continue the fight. His leadership was based on persuasion, not absolute command, and this might have been a compromise that sealed their doom. The opposing theory suggests this was not a failure of leadership, but its ultimate expression, a deliberate strategic gamble. Perhaps Spartacus, a brilliant tactician who had outmaneuvered every Roman general he'd faced, believed the Republic was weak enough to be broken. His goal wasn't just escape, it was to strike a death blow at the system itself. Marching south towards Sicily, the great breadbasket of the empire and a historic hotbed of slave rebellions, was a calculated move. He aimed to reignite the flames of revolt there, rallying thousands more to his cause and effectively cutting off Rome's grain supply. In this light, turning away from the Alps wasn't a mistake. It was a bold play for total victory, a belief that he could not just escape the beast but slay it. The Roman response was swift and brutal. The Senate, utterly humiliated by the prolonged rebellion, turned to its richest citizen, Marcus Licinius Crassus. He was given 8 new legions and authority to command with brutal discipline, even reviving the ancient and terrifying practice of decimation, executing every 10th man in a disgraced unit to ensure absolute obedience. Crassus was a methodical, relentless foe, and he began to systematically box the rebel army in. He constructed a formidable set of fortifications across the toe of Italy, a wall of earthworks and palisades stretching from sea to sea, designed to trap Spartacus on the peninsula and starve his forces out. In a stunning display of ingenuity and desperation, the slave army managed to break through this cordon one winter night, filling a section of the trench with earth, wood, and even the bodies of their own fallen to create a path. But the noose was tightening. The final act played out in 71 BCE in Lucania. Spartacus, knowing Crassus's forces were being reinforced by legions returning from Spain under Pompey, appears to have decided to force a decisive battle. On the day of the fight, he reportedly killed his own horse, declaring that if he won, he would have many fine horses to choose from, and if he lost, he would have no need of one. It was the gesture of a man who knew this was the end. The battle was a savage, chaotic melee. Spartacus himself fought his way toward Crassus, hoping to end the war by killing its commander, but he was cut down by the sheer press of soldiers. His body was never officially identified. The rebellion was crushed with unimaginable cruelty. 6,000 captured slaves were crucified along the Appian Way, their bodies lining the road from Capua to Rome as a ghastly warning to anyone who would ever dare challenge the power of the Republic again. The legacy of Spartacus's fateful decision is a powerful and enduring one. His story transcends the historical details to become a universal symbol of the oppressed fighting for their freedom. His choice to turn south, whether born of fractured command or grand ambition, ensured his rebellion would be remembered not as a simple jailbreak, but as a direct and terrifying assault on the might of Rome itself. He became a legend not for the freedom he won, but for the price he was willing to pay in its pursuit. His name would echo through the ages, inspiring countless other movements and standing as an eternal testament to the idea that even those who are owned can, for a fleeting moment, become the masters of their own destiny. Yet, even as Diocletian's division created a new structural reality for the Roman world, one emperor centuries later would look at the map and see not two halves but one lost whole. In the year 527 CE, a new ruler ascended the throne in Constantinople. His name was Justinian, and he possessed a vision so vast it bordered on obsession: to reunite the entire Mediterranean world under a single Roman emperor with a single Christian faith and a single unified law. The Western Roman Empire had collapsed decades earlier, its Italian heartland now ruled by Ostrogothic kings and North Africa by the Vandals. To most, this was the irreversible course of history. To Justinian, it was an outrage that demanded correction. He would launch a military campaign of reconquest, a breathtaking attempt to roll back the tide of time itself and restore the glory of Rome. The sheer audacity of this plan cannot be overstated. Justinian's Byzantine Empire, while the richest state in the known world, was already stretched thin, defending its long eastern border against the mighty Persian Empire. To open a second, massive front in the west was a gamble that would consume the empire's entire treasury and manpower. His greatest weapon in this endeavor was not vast wealth or limitless legions, but one man of singular military genius, General Flavius Belisarius. Young, innovative, and fiercely loyal, Belisarius had already proven his worth by crushing a massive riot in Constantinople itself. Justinian gave him a small, highly disciplined force and sent him across the sea to North Africa, the first target. The campaign was a masterpiece of speed and surprise. The Vandal kingdom, grown complacent and internally divided, was utterly unprepared for Belisarius's arrival. In a matter of months, he defeated their armies in 2 decisive battles, captured the king Gelimer, and reclaimed the entire North African province for the empire. The stunning success there convinced Justinian that his grand vision was achievable. His next, far more ambitious target was Italy itself, the ancient heart of the West, now under the control of the Ostrogoths. Once again, Belisarius was the tip of the spear. He landed in Sicily and quickly secured the island, then crossed into southern Italy. His campaign was a blitzkrieg. Using a combination of brilliant tactics, psychological warfare, and the unwavering loyalty of his professional troops, he captured Naples and then, in 536, entered the eternal city of Rome itself without a fight. The Ostrogoths, realizing the magnitude of the threat, rallied under a new and capable king, Totila. What followed was not a quick victory, but a brutal, grinding war of attrition that would drag on for nearly 20 years. Rome itself changed hands multiple times, its aqueducts cut and its population decimated by siege and famine. Belisarius, despite being perpetually undermanned and underfunded by a suspicious court, fought a defensive war of incredible skill, holding onto key coastal cities. Eventually, Justinian sent another general, Narses, with a properly funded army to finally crush the Goths and complete the Italian reconquest. On a map, the achievement looked magnificent. Justinian's armies had reclaimed North Africa, Italy, and even parts of Spain. The Mediterranean was once again a Roman lake. The emperor celebrated with triumphant monuments like the breathtaking church of the San Vitale in Ravenna, whose mosaics show Justinian and his wife Theodora in imperial splendor, presenting the symbols of their Christian victory. He had seemingly achieved the impossible. This brings us to the profound historical controversy that defines Justinian's legacy. Was this reconquest a glorious last stand of Roman imperialism, a heroic effort to restore civilization to lands lost to barbarian rule? Proponents of this view see Justinian as the last Roman, a visionary who refused to accept decline. His campaigns, they argue, re-established Roman law, administration, and Orthodox Christianity across the West, preserving classical culture and extending the life of the empire for centuries. The great legal code he commissioned, the Corpus Juris Civilis, was a lasting gift to the world, a systematic codification of Roman law that would become the foundation of most modern European legal systems. In this light, the cost was worth it for the preservation of a universal ideal. The opposing perspective paints the reconquest as a catastrophic strategic blunder that fatally weakened the Byzantine Empire for generations to come. The war in Italy, in particular, was not a clean liberation but a devastating invasion that left the peninsula utterly ruined. The great cities were depopulated, the economy was shattered, and the infrastructure was destroyed. The Byzantines had bled the land white to reclaim it. Furthermore, the astronomical cost of these decades of war emptied the imperial treasury that Emperor Anastasius had so carefully filled. Justinian was forced to raise taxes to crushing levels, alienating his subjects across the empire. Most disastrously, the massive commitment of troops to the west left the empire's eastern and Balkan frontiers critically vulnerable. In the 540s, just as Belisarius was desperately trying to hold Rome, the bubonic plague, now known as the Plague of Justinian, swept through the empire, killing perhaps a third of its population and decimating its tax base and army. With its manpower and resources exhausted by the Western wars, Byzantium had no strength left to resist new threats. Within just a few years of Justinian's death, a new wave of invaders, the Lombards, would easily overrun much of the hard-won Italian territory. The Persian Empire would push aggressively in the east. The reconquest had been a Pyrrhic victory of the highest order. Justinian had won the battles but lost the future, leaving his successors an overstretched, impoverished, and vulnerable state that would spend the next centuries fighting for its very survival. His dream of restoration was a dazzling flame, but it burned so brightly that it consumed the very fuel needed to keep the empire alive. From the grand, strategic calculations of emperors and generals, we now turn to a confrontation that was meant to be a masterstroke of military glory, but instead became a landmark lesson in the power of propaganda and peace. In the 5th year of his reign, around 1274 BCE, the young pharaoh Ramesses II marched out of Egypt at the head of a massive army. His target was the strategically vital city of Kadesh, a fortress in modern-day Syria that controlled the trade routes between the great powers of the age. But Kadesh was not some undefended outpost. It was the key northern stronghold of Egypt's greatest rival, the mighty Hittite Empire. Ramesses' decision to launch this campaign was a bold declaration that he would not merely defend Egypt's borders, but aggressively expand them, reclaiming the glory of his predecessors. The ensuing battle would become the most famous and most embellished of his 67-year reign. As his army neared Kadesh, 2 captured Bedouin scouts told the pharaoh the devastating news he wanted to hear. The main Hittite army was still far to the north, too distant to reinforce the city. Believing victory was within his grasp, Ramesses rushed ahead with his lead division, the division of Ammon, to set up camp northwest of the city. The intelligence, however, was a brilliantly laid trap. The entire Hittite force, led by King Muwatalli II, was not far away at all. They were hidden in reserve just on the other side of the ancient fortress. What followed was a masterclass in ancient battlefield deception and a near catastrophe for Egypt. As the rest of the Egyptian army straggled behind, the Hittites launched a devastating surprise attack. 2,500 chariots, each carrying 3 warriors instead of the Egyptian 2, smashed into the division of Re, which was still marching toward the camp. The Egyptian force was utterly routed, and the panicked survivors fled directly into Ramesses' unprepared camp, spreading chaos and terror. In a matter of moments, the pharaoh found himself surrounded, his personal guard fighting for their lives against an enemy that seemed to have emerged from the very earth. The ancient accounts, carved with breathtaking detail on the walls of the Ramesseum, Luxor, Karnak, and Abu Simbel, describe the young king's valor in this desperate hour. Abandoned by his fleeing troops, he single-handedly charges the enemy again and again, his divine power alone holding back the Hittite tide until a mysterious Egyptian force, perhaps the elite Neron troops arriving from the coast, struck the Hittites in the rear and turned the battle. The official Egyptian record is unequivocal. Ramesses, through his superhuman courage and the favor of the god Ammon, had snatched a glorious victory from the jaws of defeat. The inscriptions proclaim him Rameses the Great Victory, who crushed the land of Hatti by himself alone, whose army and chariotry abandoned him. But this narrative plunges us directly into the heart of the controversy that has surrounded this battle for over 3,000 years. Was the Battle of Kadesh a brilliant, against all odds victory spun into legend, or was it a near-disastrous military blunder that was expertly whitewashed by one of history's most prolific propaganda machines? The archaeological and historical evidence from the Hittite side tells a very different story. Their records make no mention of a great defeat. They claim to have held the field after the first day's fighting, and more importantly, they retained control of the city of Kadesh itself. The most likely scenario, supported by most modern historians, is that the battle was a bloody stalemate. Rameses's army was mauled and forced to retreat, but it was not annihilated. The Hittites inflicted heavy losses and defended their prize, but they lacked the strength to pursue and destroy the Egyptian force. Both sides could claim they had not lost, but neither had achieved their strategic objective. This is where the story takes its most fascinating turn. 16 years after this indecisive clash, the two empires did something almost unprecedented in the ancient world. Exhausted by decades of costly warfare and facing new threats on their frontiers, the Egyptians from the Sea Peoples and Libyans, the Hittites from the rising power of Assyria, Rameses, and the new Hittite king, Hattusili III, made a monumental decision. They would end their war not with a final, decisive battle, but with a formal treaty of perpetual peace and brotherhood. The agreement they signed, known as the Egyptian-Hittite Peace Treaty or the Treaty of Kadesh, is a stunning document. Preserved in both Egyptian hieroglyphics and Hittite cuneiform on a clay tablet discovered at the Hittite capital of Hattusa, it is the oldest surviving peace treaty in the world whose text has been fully recovered. Its terms were remarkably modern and balanced. It established clear boundaries between the two empires, with Kadesh officially recognized as part of the Hittite sphere. It contained a mutual defense pact, a promise of non-aggression, and an extradition clause for political refugees. Most remarkably, it invoked the gods of both lands as witnesses, a powerful act of mutual religious respect. They pledged to never take hostile action against the other, and to come to each other's aid if attacked by a third party or faced with internal rebellion. This leads to the ultimate assessment of Rameses's decisions. His initial choice to attack Kadesh was a reckless gamble that nearly cost him his life and his army, a mistake born of overconfidence and poor intelligence. But his later choice to embrace diplomacy over continued war was a stroke of genius that secured his legacy far more effectively than any military victory could have. By signing the treaty, he transformed a military draw into a diplomatic triumph. He could present himself to his people not as a king who had failed to conquer, but as a statesman so powerful that his greatest rival was forced to sue for peace as an equal. The propaganda campaign was seamless. The near defeat was recast as a glorious victory, and the pragmatic peace that followed was framed as the Hittites' submission to his magnanimity. The true victory, however, belonged not to Rameses or the Hittites, but to the idea of peace itself. The treaty ushered in an unprecedented era of stability and cooperation between the two superpowers. They exchanged letters, traded goods, and even arranged a royal marriage, with Rameses wedding a Hittite princess to seal the bond. For the people living under their rule, this meant an end to the brutal border raids and the economic drain of perpetual war. Rameses's reign would go on to be the longest and most prosperous of the new kingdom, a period of immense architectural achievement. His true legacy is therefore a complex duality, a master of political spin who turned a potential humiliation into a legend of personal heroism, but also a pragmatic leader wise enough to see that true power is not always measured in captured cities, but in the security and prosperity that comes from a lasting peace. Yet after centuries of Roman emperors carefully crafting an image of distant, godlike authority, one man would shatter that precedent in the most public and shocking way imaginable. In the late 2nd century CE, the Emperor Commodus, son of the respected philosopher King Marcus Aurelius, decided that the imperial palace was not enough of a stage for him. He craved the roar of the crowd, the smell of the sand, and the glory of personal combat. He descended into the arena not as a spectator, but as a gladiator, and in doing so, he unleashed a political scandal that would define his reign and ultimately seal his fate. This was not the occasional, symbolic appearance of a nobleman testing his skill. Commodus's participation was an obsession. According to the historian Cassius Dio, who witnessed these spectacles himself, the emperor fought in the arena hundreds of times, though always in carefully controlled conditions. The matches were meticulously rigged for his safety and glory. His opponents were often given blunt weapons or were themselves physically handicapped. Animals brought in for him to slaughter were often tethered or drugged to ensure they posed no real threat. The victories were preordained, the danger largely theatrical. Yet for Commodus, it was utterly real. He demanded the vast sums of prize money traditionally paid to gladiators, a staggering 1 million sesterces per appearance, which he then used to replenish the drained imperial treasury, effectively paying himself from the public coffers for his own performances. His appearances were a bizarre fusion of imperial pageantry and bloodsport. He would enter the Flavian amphitheater not through the gladiator's gate, but in the full regalia of the emperor, carried on a platform shouldered by 24 men. Yet once in the arena, he would shed his imperial purple for the arms of a secutor, a gladiator class, though his gear was anything but standard. He often fought with weapons crafted from solid silver, and his helmet was fashioned not to conceal his identity, but to present a gleaming, idealized portrait of his own face. The symbolism was chaotic and deeply unsettling to the Roman elite. He was blending the ultimate symbol of servitude and infamy, the gladiator, with the sacred office of emperor. This forces us to confront the central, bizarre controversy of his actions. Was this all an elaborate, if unhinged, populist strategy? From this perspective, Commodus was a master showman who understood the power of bread and circuses better than any of his predecessors. The common people of Rome, weary of his father's long, draining wars on the Danube, craved spectacle and direct engagement. By presenting himself as Hercules reborn, a divine hero who labored for the people, and fighting in the arena, he was forging a direct, emotional bond with the plebeians over the heads of the skeptical Senate. He was giving them what they wanted, unparalleled entertainment and the thrilling sight of their emperor, a living god, performing feats of strength for their amusement. In this light, his actions were a calculated, if crude, form of political theater designed to secure the loyalty of the mob. The opposing view held by the senatorial class and many historians since sees not a political genius but a narcissistic madman completely divorced from the dignity of his office. The Roman aristocracy held a profound contempt for gladiators, who were typically slaves, criminals, or social outcasts. For the emperor to not only associate with them but to become one was the ultimate degradation of the principate. Cassius Dio, a senator, wrote with palpable disgust about these spectacles, seeing them as clear evidence of Commodus's mental instability and tyrannical whims. The emperor wasn't connecting with the people, he was humiliating the entire state by reducing its highest office to a carnival act. His demand for gladiatorial pay was not a fiscal strategy but a symptom of a mind that could no longer distinguish between the treasury of Rome and his personal wallet. The tension between these two interpretations is perfectly captured in Ridley Scott's film Gladiator, though with significant historical license. The film's portrayal of Commodus as a jealous, patricidal man-child who murders his father and craves the love of the mob captures the essence of the historical controversy. While the real Commodus almost certainly did not kill Marcus Aurelius, the cinematic version brilliantly illustrates the perceived insecurity and narcissism that likely drove his actions. Joaquin Phoenix's portrayal of the emperor entering the arena to execute defenseless prisoners and demand adulation brings to life the terrifying combination of absolute power, fragile ego, and performative cruelty that the ancient sources describe. Ultimately, Commodus's gladiatorial career was not a sustainable political strategy but a symptom of a decaying reign. His performances in the arena were the most visible sign of a broader pattern of erratic and autocratic behavior that alienated the very power brokers, the Praetorian Guard and the senatorial class, whose support was essential. By trampling on centuries of tradition and openly mocking the dignity of his station, he made himself impossible to respect and dangerous to tolerate. His controversial decision to seek glory in the sand was not a populist masterstroke, but the final, flamboyant act of a ruler who had lost all sense of reality. It was a performance that thrilled the crowd for a moment, but it convinced the powerful that the emperor himself had to be removed from the stage. But if Commodus's arena antics represented the degradation of the imperial office, a different emperor, just 2 centuries later, would use his authority not for personal spectacle, but to orchestrate the most profound spiritual transformation the Western world had ever seen. The stage for this revolution was set in the year 380 CE in the eastern Roman capital of Constantinople. The emperor was Theodosius I, a hard-nosed military commander from Spain who had recently been elevated to the purple. The Roman world was still reeling from the recent trauma of the Battle of Adrianople, where a Gothic army had annihilated a Roman force and killed the Emperor Valens. The empire felt fractured, vulnerable, and spiritually adrift, with deep divisions between traditional pagans, various Christian sects, and even within Christianity itself over the nature of the Trinity. It was into this ferment of anxiety that Theodosius, a devout and fervent Nicene Christian, thrust his monumental Edict of Thessalonica. This was not a mere suggestion or a token of support, it was an absolute imperial command. The edict declared that all subjects of the Roman Empire must profess the faith of the bishops of Rome and Alexandria, that is, the doctrine of the Trinity as defined by the Council of Nicaea. It branded those who did not, followers of Arianism and other heterodoxies, as foolish madmen and heretics who would face not only divine condemnation but also the punishment of our authority. For the first time, the full coercive power of the Roman state was placed behind one specific version of one specific religion. The following year, Theodosius and his co-emperor Gratian went even further, issuing laws that specifically prohibited pagan worship, outlawing sacrifices and closing temples. To understand the sheer weight of this decision, we must step back and appreciate the religious landscape of the late 4th century. Christianity was a powerful force, but it was far from universal. The old pagan traditions, though declining, still held powerful sway among the old senatorial aristocracy in Rome and in the vast conservative countryside. Many Roman soldiers still swore by the war god Mars, and philosophers in Athens still taught the wisdom of Plato and Aristotle in the shadow of the Parthenon. Theodosius's decree was a direct assault on this 1500-year-old tradition. It was the culmination of a process begun by Constantine, but it went miles further. Constantine had legalized Christianity. Theodosius was effectively criminalizing everything else. He didn't stop at edicts. To enforce theological uniformity, he convened the First Council of Constantinople in 381, which refined the Nicene Creed into the version still recited in churches today. This was about creating a single orthodox doctrine for a single orthodox empire, and the visual transformation of the empire was just as dramatic. Across the Roman world, the skyline began to change. Magnificent Christian basilicas like the Church of the Holy Apostles in Constantinople rose on prime imperial land, their vast, spacious interiors designed to accommodate thousands of worshippers. But perhaps the most potent symbol of this shift was the repurposing of pagan spaces. temples were not always destroyed, often they were simply converted. The Parthenon in Athens, for instance, was transformed into a church, its pagan altar removed and its iconic statues of the gods defaced or toppled. The very stones of the old world were being spiritually reconsecrated for the new. This monumental shift forces us to confront a deeply controversial question. Was Theodosius's decision a necessary act of unification, a masterstroke that provided the fractured empire with the single, cohesive ideological glue it desperately needed to survive? Proponents of this view argue that the old pagan system, tied to individual cities and 1,000 different local gods, was utterly incapable of binding together a vast, multicultural empire facing existential threats. Christianity, with its universal message, its highly organized church structure that mirrored the imperial administration, and its emphasis on obedience to authority, offered a powerful new source of unity. In an age of crisis, a unified faith could create a unified people, giving them a common purpose and a common identity as a new Christian Rome. The closing of the temples was not mere intolerance, it was the dismantling of an outdated competitor to state power. The opposing perspective, however, sees this not as an act of unity, but as the birth of institutionalized religious intolerance in the West. For the first time, the state had declared a monopoly on truth and empowered itself to punish wrong belief. The edict unleashed a wave of violence that went far beyond official policy. While Theodosius himself was often pragmatic, he famously did public penance after a massacre in Thessalonica. His laws gave a green light to zealous bishops and militant monks. Figures like Saint Ambrose of Milan exerted immense pressure on the emperor to take a harder line, while monks like the notorious Sleepless Ones in Constantinople led mobs to destroy synagogues and smash the revered Serapeum, the great temple of Serapis in Alexandria. This was the dark side of the triumph, the systematic persecution of pagans and heretics, the burning of libraries housing pagan texts, and the violent suppression of religious diversity that would set a tragic precedent for centuries of religious wars to come. Theodosius's decision to fuse church and state so completely created a world where faith was enforced by the sword, forever changing the relationship between belief and power. He sought to create one empire under one God, but in doing so, he inaugurated an era where divergence from that God's doctrine became not just a sin, but a capital crime. But our journey through these pivotal moments would be incomplete without returning to the very beginning, to the source of the idea itself. Centuries before Rameses fought at Kadesh, before the pyramids even pierced the Egyptian sky, the land between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, known as Mesopotamia, was a world of walled cities, each with its own king, its own gods, and its own army. This was Sumer, a collection of fiercely independent city-states like Uruk, and Lagash, often at war but always maintaining their distinct identities. Then, around 2300 BCE, a figure emerged from the shadows of legend who would shatter this system forever. His name was Sargon, and his decision to not just conquer these cities, but to permanently bind them together under his sole rule, created a new political reality, the empire. The story of his rise, as told in later Babylonian legends, is the ultimate tale of the underdog. He was said to be the illegitimate son of a priestess who placed him in a reed basket and set him adrift on the Euphrates River, a narrative that chillingly foreshadows the story of Moses millennia later. He was rescued and raised by a gardener, eventually rising to become the cupbearer to the king of the city of Kish. But Sargon was destined for more than serving wine. He overthrew his master and then turned his gaze outward. His innovation was not just in military tactics, but in ambition. He didn't want to merely defeat a rival city and demand tribute. He sought to erase their independence completely and rule them directly from his new capital, the strategically placed city of Agade. His campaign was one of relentless, systematic expansion. Using a highly professionalized army, legend says he had 5,400 men, eating bread before him every day, suggesting a standing, loyal force. He marched up and down the Tigris and Euphrates. One by one, the proud Sumerian city-states fell before him. The victory was total. To commemorate his triumph over the king of Uruk, he had a magnificent stone pillar carved, now known as the Victory Stele of Sargon. While the stele itself is lost to history, descriptions suggest it depicted the conquered ruler in a net, humiliated before the triumphant Akkadian king, a powerful piece of propaganda announcing a new world order. But the true and most controversial genius of Sargon's decision lay in what he did after the fighting stopped. He made the breathtaking choice to install Akkadian governors and administrators in the conquered cities, often from his own family, creating the world's first centralized bureaucracy. He standardized weights and measures to facilitate trade and taxation across his new domains. Most astonishingly, he allowed the subjugated peoples to maintain their local customs and religions, even as he demanded their ultimate loyalty to him and his gods in Akkad. This was the birth of the multi-ethnic empire, a political entity that could incorporate diverse peoples under a single, powerful crown. Inscriptions boast that merchants from Melu, likely the Indus Valley civilization, docked at Agade's quays, and ships from Magan, modern-day Oman, brought their goods. He had created an economic and political network on a scale never before imagined. This revolutionary approach forces us to confront a fundamental historical debate that echoes all the way to our modern era. Was Sargon's creation of the First Empire a groundbreaking innovation in human governance, a necessary step toward greater social complexity and cultural exchange? From this perspective, he was a visionary administrator. His empire brought an end to the constant, draining warfare between the Mesopotamian city-states, creating a Pax Arcadia that allowed for unprecedented stability. The flow of goods and ideas across this vast territory spurred artistic and technological development. The Akkadian language became the lingua franca of diplomacy and trade for centuries, much like English is today. His model of centralized rule, with a professional bureaucracy answering to a supreme ruler, became the template for every empire that followed, from the Assyrians and Persians to the Romans. In this light, he wasn't just a conqueror, he was a political genius who invented a new way for humans to organize themselves. Yet the opposing view cannot be ignored. Did Sargon's decision inaugurate the brutal, oppressive history of imperialism itself? His conquests were undoubtedly violent. The Sumerian king list, a later document, tersely notes that he laid waste to the land. The very concept of forcing diverse peoples to submit to a distant capital, often against their will, began with him. His system, while efficient, was built on the bedrock of military domination and the extraction of wealth from the periphery to the center. The resentment this bred was powerful. Later Sumerian laments, like the Curse of Agade, describe how the gods, angered by Sargon's pride and Chinese letter of his bustling capital, withdrew their favor and brought famine and chaos, leading to the empire's eventual collapse. This narrative frames his achievement not as progress, but as the original sin of state-sponsored aggression, setting a precedent for every bloody conquest and subjugation that would stain the pages of history thereafter. The truth, as is so often the case, resides in the uncomfortable space between these two poles. Sargon of Akkad was likely both a brilliant administrator and a ruthless conqueror. His decision to forge an empire was a monumental turning point, a door in history that, once opened, could never be closed. He demonstrated the immense benefits of large-scale organization, peace, prosperity, and cultural flowering, but he also revealed its terrifying cost, the loss of local autonomy and the birth of organized, state-level violence on a massive scale. His legacy is the empire itself, a form of human organization that has been the source of both our greatest artistic achievements and our most horrific wars. He was the first to grasp that true power lies not just in winning a battle, but in building a system that endures long after the last sword is sheathed. While the Persian Empire stretched from the Indus to the Aegean, a power was awakening in the rugged, mountainous north of Greece that would soon eclipse them all. But this was not the story of a single, godlike conqueror emerging fully formed. It was the story of a calculating, relentless king who meticulously built the weapon his son would someday unleash upon the world. That king was Philip II of Macedon, and his decision to transform his backward kingdom into a military and political superpower through a series of brutal, brilliant reforms is one of history's most consequential and controversial turnarounds. When Philip took the throne in 359 BCE, Macedonia was a fringe player, a land of semi-barbaric hill tribes viewed with contempt by the sophisticated city-states of southern Greece. It was weak, internally divided, and threatened on all sides by powerful neighbors like the Illyrians and Paeonians. Philip himself had spent years as a hostage in Thebes, where he witnessed the cutting-edge military tactics of the day firsthand. He returned home not as a defeated pawn, but as a master strategist with a vision. He saw Macedonia's weaknesses not as curses, but as opportunities. Its rough, hardy population was the perfect raw material for a new kind of army. Its isolation from the endless squabbles of the Greek city-states gave him the freedom to experiment and build without constant interference. His reforms were comprehensive and revolutionary, starting with the very heart of his military, the infantry phalanx. The Greek hoplite phalanx was a powerful but cumbersome formation, reliant on heavily armored citizens armed with a large round shield and a thrusting spear. Philip's genius was to make it longer, lighter, and deadlier. He equipped his infantry with the sarissa, a pike of astounding length, some 18 feet of seasoned cornel wood tipped with a lethal iron point. This wasn't just a longer spear, it was a complete reimagining of battlefield dynamics. Imagine a wall of these weapons projecting 15 feet beyond the front line, creating an impenetrable, advancing forest of sharpened iron that enemy hoplites couldn't even get close enough to strike. To visualize this, picture a traditional Greek phalanx. It's a dense block of men, their large shields interlocked, their shorter spears able to jab at the enemy just a few feet away. Now overlay Philip's Macedonian phalanx. His formation is deeper, perhaps 16 men ranks deep. The first 5 ranks lower their sarissas, creating a deadly, multi-layered hedgehog of spear points that extends far beyond the enemy's reach. The rear ranks keep their pikes angled upright, deflecting incoming arrows. This phalanx was not designed for agility. It was an anvil, an unstoppable, grinding force meant to pin and crush the enemy's main line. But an anvil is useless without a hammer. Philip's second masterstroke was the creation of the companion cavalry, or heteroi. This was not a disorganized mob of aristocratic horsemen. It was a professional, shock cavalry corps, the first of its kind. He armed them with the Xyston, a 12-foot lance, and trained them to charge in a tight wedge formation that could smash through enemy lines at a specific, weakened point. The phalanx would hold the enemy in place, and the companions would deliver the decisive, killing blow. This combined arms approached the synergy of an unbreakable infantry anvil and a devastating cavalry hammer was Philip's true innovation. He further integrated specialized light troops, skirmishers, and a sophisticated siege train capable of reducing fortified cities, a talent he learned from Greek engineers. But Philip knew an army is only as strong as the state that funds it. His political and economic reforms were just as shrewd. He reorganized the Macedonian nobility, binding them to the crown through land grants and positions within his new army, turning potential rivals into invested partners. He took control of the rich gold and silver mines of Mount Pangaeus, flooding his treasury with wealth that allowed him to pay his soldiers a full-time professional wage year-round. For the first time, Macedonia had a standing army, loyal to the king and constantly training, not a militia of farmers who had to return home for the harvest. This newfound power gave Philip an insatiable ambition. He began a methodical, expansionist campaign, first securing his borders by crushing the Illyrians and Paeonians, then turning his gaze south toward the fractious, distracted Greek city-states, particularly Athens and Thebes. He used a masterful blend of bribery, diplomacy, and outright military threat, famously stating that no fortress is impregnable to which a donkey laden with gold can be led. He played the Greeks against each other, positioning himself not as a foreign invader, but as a potential leader of a unified Hellenic League. This brings us to the great historical controversy surrounding his reign. Were Philip's reforms and expansion a necessary, visionary project to unify the quarrelsome Greek world and prepare it for a grand crusade against Persia? Or were they simply the aggressive, imperialist actions of an ambitious monarch who destabilized and ultimately extinguished Greek freedom for his own glory? Proponents of the first view argue that Greece was in a state of terminal decline, locked in a cycle of petty wars between city-states that had exhausted themselves during the Peloponnesian War. Philip offered a new model, a strong, centralized monarchy that could harness Greek culture and manpower for a greater purpose. His victory, they claim, ended the internecine warfare and created the unified Macedonian Greek state that made Alexander's conquests possible. He didn't destroy Greece, he saved it from itself and gave its culture a vehicle for global domination. The opposing perspective, passionately argued by the Athenian orator Demosthenes in his fiery Philippics, saw Philip as a monstrous, manipulative tyrant. To them, he was a barbarian from the north who spoke poor Greek and used his gold and his army to corrupt and subjugate the birthplace of democracy and freedom. His reforms weren't visionary, they were the building of a brutal war machine for the sole purpose of conquest. He didn't unify Greece, he enslaved it, replacing its cherished polis independence with the authoritarian rule of a single, absolute monarch. The climax of this struggle, and the ultimate test of Philip's new military system, came on the plain of Chaeronea in Boeotia in the year 338 BCE. On one side stood an alliance of Greek city-states, including the legendary Theban sacred band and the Athenian hoplite militia. On the other stood Philip's professional Macedonian army, with the 18-year-old Alexander commanding the elite companion cavalry on the left wing. The battle was a masterpiece of tactical deception and the perfect execution of Philip's anvil and hammer doctrine. As the lines engaged, Philip's right wing, which he commanded personally, deliberately began to retreat, drawing the eager Athenian left forward and creating a fatal gap in the Greek line. Into this gap, Alexander drove the companion cavalry wedge with terrifying force, shattering the Greek center. At the same moment, Philip halted his feigned retreat and turned his veteran phalanx against the now disorganized Athenians. The Greek army was crushed between the anvil of the phalanx and the hammer of the cavalry. The Theban sacred band, the elite unit of 150 pairs of male lovers, famously died to the last man where they stood, a monument to the end of an era. Philip's victory at Chaeronea was total. It broke the power of the independent Greek city-states forever. He formed the League of Corinth, a federation with himself as its military leader or hegemon, and declared a pan-Hellenic war against the Persian Empire. He had achieved his goal, a united Greece under Macedonian leadership. Yet, just as he stood at the pinnacle of his power, preparing to cross into Asia, he was assassinated by one of his own bodyguards during his daughter's wedding feast. The motives remain shrouded in mystery. Was it a personal grievance, a plot by a jilted wife, or the hand of Persia seeking to stop the invasion? Philip's controversial legacy is therefore a profound paradox. He was the architect of a military machine that would change the world, a political genius who forged a nation from a tribal backwater. But he was also the man who ended classical Greek liberty, replacing the vibrant, chaotic world of the city-state with the top-down control of the Hellenistic monarchy. His decisions set the stage for Alexander's breathtaking conquests, but they also asked a terrible price, the sacrifice of freedom for the sake of glory, a trade-off that would echo through the ages as the eternal dilemma of power. Now, from the grim realities of Tiberius's isolation and its bloody consequences, we turn to a story so bizarre it has become the ultimate symbol of ancient Roman insanity. It's a tale that involves an emperor, his favorite horse, and one of the highest political offices in the Republic. The emperor is, of course, Caligula, and the decision in question is his alleged appointment of his equine companion, Incitatus, to the sacred rank of consul. The story, as passed down to us by the historian Suetonius writing decades later, is as outrageous as it sounds. He claims that Caligula loved this horse so deeply that he provided it with a marble stable, an ivory manger, a jeweled collar, and even a house of its own, complete with furniture and a staff of servants to entertain any guests the horse might receive. The punchline, the moment that has echoed through the ages, is the assertion that Caligula planned to make Incitatus a consul of Rome. The consulship was no mere honorary title. It was the pinnacle of a Roman politician's career, a position once held by figures like Julius Caesar and Cincinnatus, vested with immense executive power. To bestow it upon an animal was the most profound insult imaginable to the entire senatorial class. This anecdote has been seized upon for centuries as the smoking gun, the definitive proof that Caligula was a raving lunatic completely detached from reality. It perfectly fits the narrative of a man who declared war on Neptune and held conversations with the moon, a ruler who would place a beast on equal footing with the most revered statesman of Rome must have been utterly mad. This interpretation is seductive in its simplicity, painting a clear picture of a tyrant's descent into sheer absurdity. But what if we've been reading this story all wrong? A growing number of modern historians argue that the appointment of Incitatus was not an act of madness, but perhaps the most brilliantly cruel piece of political satire ever conducted. To understand this, we have to look at Caligula's deeply antagonistic relationship with the Roman Senate. He saw them not as partners in governance, but as a pack of hypocritical, scheming aristocrats who had conspired against his family and who now offered him only sycophantic flattery while secretly plotting his demise. He held them in utter contempt. From this perspective, the entire Incitatus affair was not about honoring a horse, it was about humiliating the Senate. It was a calculated, performative act designed to demonstrate his absolute power and their utter worthlessness. The message was devastatingly clear. In Caligula's Rome, even his animal was more deserving of high office than they were. The elaborate house, the servants, the promised consulship, it was all an extended joke, a piece of political theater where the senators were the unwilling punchline. He was holding up a mirror to their corruption and emptiness, proving that the entire system of honors and titles was so debased that a horse could perform the job just as well. The debate over historical accuracy is fierce. There is no concrete evidence, like a senatorial decree or an official inscription, that Incitatus was ever formally appointed. Suetonius himself uses the word promised, not appointed. Many scholars now believe the story is an exaggeration or a misunderstanding. Perhaps Caligula, in a fit of anger at the Senate, threatened to do it as a way to shock them into obedience. Maybe he did bestow some of the ceremonial trappings of the office upon the horse as part of his ongoing mockery. The truth likely lies somewhere between the literal and the symbolic. It was probably not a formal administrative act, but a very public and deliberate insult that became magnified into legend. The controversy forces us to choose our lens. Do we see a clinically insane man, lost in delusions of grandeur, who genuinely believed his horse was a suitable statesman? Or do we see a sadistic, narcissistic, but ultimately sane young emperor who understood power dynamics perfectly and used this absurdist spectacle to dominate and degrade the political class he hated? Was it the act of a madman or the method of a tyrant? The story of Incitatus endures because it sits at that perfect crossroads, a moment in history that challenges us to decide where the line lies between genius and insanity, and reminds us that sometimes the most effective way to destroy your enemies is not to execute them, but to simply laugh at them, even if the joke is on a truly historic scale. From the sands of Egypt to the forums of Rome, the battlefields of Greece to the palaces of Persia, we've journeyed through 2.5 millennia of human ambition, witnessing the moments where a single choice could alter the destiny of civilizations. We stood with Akhenaten as he gambled his kingdom on one god, and with Constantine as he bet an empire on another. We watched Boudica channel her rage into a firestorm of rebellion, and Ashoka transform his horror at war into a profound philosophy of peace. We saw Cyrus build an empire on tolerance and Qin Shi Huang try to forge one through terror. We witnessed the cold calculation of Philip II and the blazing audacity of his son Alexander, the pragmatic division of Diocletian and the desperate reunification dream of Justinian. These 25 stories are more than just history. They are a masterclass in the human condition under absolute power. They reveal the immense pressure that rests on the shoulders of those who command nations, where the line between visionary and madman is often drawn by the victors. A decision that seems like sheer insanity to one generation: Caligula's war on the sea, Nero's scapegoating of the Christians, might be revealed upon closer inspection as a chillingly rational, if brutal, political calculation. The genius of Hannibal's crossing of the Alps is inseparable from the folly of its devastating cost. Caesar's crossing of the Rubicon was both a necessary act of self-preservation and the death knell for the republic he claimed to save. The recurring themes are as powerful today as they were thousands of years ago. The eternal tension between unity and freedom, the seductive allure of absolute control, and the devastating cost of ambition. We see leaders grappling with the same fundamental questions we still face. Does stability require the suppression of dissent? Can great achievements justify terrible means? Is it better to be feared or loved? These ancient rulers experimented with every possible answer, their lives and deaths serving as the ultimate case studies. What makes these decisions so perpetually controversial is that they resist easy judgment. We cannot simply label them good or evil. They exist in a complex gray area where brilliant statecraft coexists with breathtaking cruelty, and personal trauma influences global politics. The same impulse that drove Ashoka to champion non-violence also drove Qin Shi Huang to bury scholars alive, a profound desire to shape the human heart and mind, to impose a singular vision of order upon a chaotic world. Their legacies are a paradox. They built wonders and unleashed horrors. They expanded the horizons of trade and knowledge while extinguishing cultures and ideas. They advanced law and architecture through the brutal engine of conquest and slavery. They were, in the end, profoundly human, flawed, fearful, arrogant, and ambitious, but with the terrifying power to magnify their every flaw and virtue onto the canvas of history itself. So now we turn it over to you. After this journey through the ages, which of these monumental gambles stands out to you as the most controversial? Was it Ashoka's radical embrace of peace after the nightmare of Kalinga? Was it Constantine's political embrace of a persecuted faith? Or perhaps the chilling logic behind Qin Shi Huang's burning of the books and burying of the scholars? Share your thoughts and debates in the comments below. We love hearing your perspectives, and if you enjoyed this deep dive into the minds that shaped our world, be sure to subscribe and hit the notification bell for more explorations into history's greatest mysteries.